There exists, somewhere in the archives of the Austrian National Library, a ledger so old that its pages have turned the color of parchment bones. And in those ledgers, written in the careful hand of merchants whose names have nearly vanished from memory, are the debts of emperors. Not small debts, not the casual borrowings of a struggling nobleman needing funds for a small war or a marriage alliance. These are the debts that held together the Holy Roman Empire itself, and they were owed to a family you have almost certainly never heard of, a family so wealthy that they make the Rockefellers and the Carnegies of the industrial age seem like a second chapter in a much older story. Imagine it is the year 1525, and you are standing in a candlelit counting house in the city of Augsburg, in what is now southern Germany, though the map of Europe at that moment looks like something from a dream where borders shift with each generation. The candles are wax, expensive, the kind that do not smoke and blacken like tallow. Around you, on every surface, leather-bound ledgers lay open like dark flowers, their pages filled with numbers in cramped italic script. On the heavy wooden tables, silver coins are arranged in careful stacks, sorted by weight and purity, their surfaces catching the warm light and throwing it back in small dancing reflections. The coins bear the stamps of a dozen kingdoms and dukedoms. Some come from the silver mines deep beneath the Tyrolean mountains. Others have traveled by merchant ship from ports you could not find on any map. The air in this room smells of leather and candle wax, and something metallic and cool, the way coins smell when they are handled by many hands. There is no sound but the scratch of quill on paper, and the soft clink of coins being counted and weighed on delicate brass scales. A man in a dark woolen coat sits at the largest table, his face illuminated by the candle flame, his eyes moving across columns of figures with the focus of someone reading scripture. He is not young. His hands, which move with practiced precision from coin to ledger to scale, show the careful wear of decades spent in this exact work. If you asked him his name, he would tell you it with a kind of quiet pride, the way a man might speak of a sword that has been handed down through generations. He would tell you he is Jakob, and that Jakob is a name that matters, that Jakob is a name that has come to mean something in the world of money and power and the slow, intricate machinery by which empires function. But we are not yet ready to name him fully. Not yet. First, we must understand the light in which he works. We must understand what it means that a merchant family from a small city in Germany has become so essential to the functioning of royal power that emperors write to them not with demands, but with careful politeness. What does it mean that the greatest rulers of the age cannot move without consulting the ledgers of men in counting houses? What strange alchemy transforms coins and silk and copper ore into the ability to reshape the map of Europe itself? If you find yourself drawn to the quiet stories of how money actually worked before the modern age, to the true histories of the families who quietly held the world's wealth before industry was even imagined, I invite you to subscribe. We are going to spend time in these counting houses, in the archives, in the mines and markets and churches where the Fugger family built an empire so vast and so carefully hidden that even today most people have never heard their name. But their name was once whispered in the chambers of the most powerful people on earth. So let us return now to that moment. The candles are still burning, the coins are still being counted, and the story of how one family from Augsburg came to own the machinery of empire is about to unfold in the long, slow hours before sleep comes. Picture the city that surrounds this counting house. Augsburg in the 15th and 16th centuries was not a capital, not a seat of royal power. It was simply a city where things happened to connect. The Danube River flowed nearby, connecting to major trade routes that moved north and south. From here, a merchant could send goods toward Venice and the Mediterranean, or toward the Baltic and the North Sea. From here, you could eventually reach Lisbon, or Constantinople, or the Levantine coasts where spices and silk arrived from lands so distant they seemed almost legendary. Augsburg sat at a crossing point, at a moment when the old medieval way of organizing commerce was slowly beginning to shift into something new. The guilds still held power, still controlled what could be made and sold, and for how much. But alongside the guilds, something else was growing, something more fluid, something that would eventually prove far more powerful than any guild could ever be. This was the world of long-distance trade. This was the world of credit and debt, of letters of exchange that moved across Europe faster than ships could carry physical goods. This was the world where a merchant in Augsburg could lend money to a king in Spain and have that debt secured not by immediate payment, but by a contract written in such careful legal language that it held the weight of law itself. It was a world that required a certain kind of mind, a mind that could hold many numbers in careful balance, a mind that understood not just the present price of a thing, but its future price, a mind that could see patterns where others saw only chaos, a mind that could look at the raw materials of the earth, the silver and copper hidden in mountains, and see them as the foundation of power. In the last decades of the 14th century, as the medieval world was beginning to age and crack, a man arrived in Augsburg. His name was Hans Fugger. He was a weaver. What brought him to this city, exactly? The records do not say with perfect clarity. Did he come seeking work in an established weaving operation? Did he come following rumors of opportunity? Did he come with some small amount of capital already in hand? Or did he arrive with nothing but skill and ambition? We can only piece together the shape of his arrival from the fragments that remain. But what matters is this: he came and he stayed. He learned the city. He began to understand how textiles flowed through Augsburg, how linen and wool arrived from the surrounding countryside, were processed, and then moved onward to the markets that paid the best prices for them. And in that learning, something shifted in him, or perhaps it was already present in him, and Augsburg simply provided the place where it could grow. Weaving was a skilled trade, but it was also, in the medieval guild system, a trade with very strict boundaries. A weaver made cloth. He belonged to the Weavers' Guild. He charged what the guild said he could charge. He could not easily become something else. But what if a man was not entirely satisfied with those boundaries? What if he could see that the real money was not in the making of cloth, but in the movement of it? Not in the labor of his hands, but in the arrangement of networks? Not in being bound to one city and one craft, but in being free to move between cities, to connect buyers and sellers, to understand the patterns of supply and demand before they became obvious to everyone else? Hans Fugger, at some point in his early years in Augsburg, made a choice. He was a weaver, yes, but he would not only weave, he would also trade. He would buy cloth from other weavers and sell it to merchants who moved goods along the great trade routes. He would be, in other words, a middleman, and in being a middleman he would discover something that the strictly regulated guilds had never intended: the possibility of accumulating capital far more quickly than any single craft allowed. The shift was subtle. It might not have seemed like a revolution to the people living through it, but it was. A man who had once been bound by the rules of the Weavers' Guild was beginning to free himself, becoming something new, not quite a merchant yet, not quite a banker, but moving in that direction, feeling his way forward into a world that had not yet decided what to call people like him. And in this gradual transformation, the seed of the Fugger Empire was planted, not as a grand plan, not as something Hans Fugger sat down and decided all at once, but as a series of small choices, small observations, small risks taken. He was learning the language of money itself. And Augsburg, with all its connections and its crossing points, was the perfect place to learn it. If you find yourself drawn to the quieter corners of history, those moments when wealth and power moved through shadows and ledgers rather than trumpets and thrones, You might consider following along as we explore more of these forgotten empires together. There are stories scattered across centuries of families and merchants who shaped the world so completely that their names have become almost invisible, worn smooth by time like river stones. The Fuggers are only one thread in a much larger tapestry of financial dynasties whose influence echoed across continents and centuries, often in ways that nobody saw coming and few remember now. The invitation, gentle as it is, simply asks this. If you enjoyed settling into the particular quietness of this Augsburg counting house, with its careful tallies and its secret geometries of gold, then perhaps you'd return to discover others like it. There are the Medici, whose fingers reached into Florence and Rome and beyond, threading influence through art and banking and the church itself. There are the merchant princes of Venice, whose galleons cut through Mediterranean trade routes with such precision that they rewrote the rules of commerce for an entire world. There are the later dynasties, the Barings, the Rothschilds, whose names carry a different weight, a different era, yet share something profound with the Fuggers, an understanding that true wealth is not merely accumulation, but architecture. It is the patient construction of systems that outlive the builder. What makes these stories worth returning to, night after night, is that they teach us something that ordinary history books often miss. They show us how the world actually changed, not through the speeches of kings, though kings spoke plenty, but through the calculations of accountants, through the careful breeding of trust, through the slow, deliberate weaving of obligation and benefit across kingdoms and centuries. The Fuggers understood something that most people never do, that whoever controls the flow of money controls the flow of power, and that the most dangerous person in any room is often the one holding the ledger, not the sword. As you lie here, perhaps imagining the weight of those leather-bound books in the Fugger vault, the cool smoothness of silver coins stacked in careful columns, you might wonder about the other families who moved through history with the same quiet confidence, the same sense of inevitable consequence. Who were the other merchants brave enough to lend money to emperors? What did they know that made them so certain they would be repaid? How did they sleep at night, knowing that a single military defeat or political upheaval could erase decades of careful accumulation? These questions have a particular resonance late at night, when the distractions of the day have finally fallen away, and the mind becomes curious about the invisible architecture beneath the surface of the world we inherited. Consider subscribing to this collection of deep, unhurried histories of the wealth dynasties whose names have faded from common memory, the families who built empires of finance and influence, and then watched those empires transform or crumble or quietly persist in the form of buildings and foundations that still stand. Each episode unfolds at the pace of thought itself, neither hurried nor stalled, allowing you to sink deeper into these stories without the friction of constant commentary or the jolt of sudden revelations. These are narratives designed for the particular mood of late evening, when the curiosity of the mind meets the softness of approaching sleep, and history becomes not a list of facts but a kind of dreaming, vivid and present and strangely intimate. The Fuggers will remain our focus for now, their rise and their slow diminishment, their architectural legacy in brick and mortar, their financial legacy in the very systems of banking that still govern our world. But the knowledge that their story is part of a larger constellation of similar tales, of men and women who understood the hidden mathematics of power, might deepen your appreciation for what you're about to learn. You're not simply tracing the life of one family, though you are. You're learning to see the world as they saw it, as a network of debts and obligations, of carefully planted seeds that would yield harvests for generations to come, of the profound patience required to build something that might last. So as we continue deeper into the story of Jakob Fugger and his ancestors, know that you're not alone in this curiosity. There are others who find themselves drawn to these quiet narratives of accumulation and loss, of the rise and gentle decline of empires built on something as ephemeral as trust and as solid as silver. To understand how the Fuggers became the Fuggers, we must first dissolve ourselves into the air of Augsburg itself, sometime in the middle of the 1400s. Not yet the thundering centre of finance and influence it would become, but rather a city caught in that peculiar threshold moment when medieval certainty begins to fracture and something newer, stranger, more mercantile starts to breathe through the cracks. Augsburg in those days was a free imperial city, which meant something quite particular. It belonged technically to the Holy Roman Emperor, but it governed itself through a complex web of guild authorities and merchant councils. Picture the city as a living organism of intersecting powers and jealousies. The patrician families who controlled the great trading companies held one kind of authority. The craft guilds, the weavers, the dyers, the metal workers, each with their own standards, their own secret techniques, their own fierce protection of who could practice their trade, held another. And the church, with its bishops and monasteries and moral pronouncements, held yet another still. To navigate Augsburg was to navigate a delicate dance between these three forces, knowing when to bow, when to persuade, when to slip a coin into a receptive palm. The city itself was ringed by walls and gates, its streets narrow and layered with the accumulated weight of centuries. The Fugger house, the family mansion that would later become legendary, did not yet exist. There were textile workshops instead, with looms clicking through their rhythms, dyers' vats releasing their acrid perfumes into the air, the sweet and choking smell of madder root and indigo mixing with wood smoke and horse dung, and the ordinary decay of medieval life. All of it was contained within these walls, within the sound of bells marking the hours from the cathedral, within the cycles of market days and feast days, and the constant, patient turning of the seasons. But Augsburg's real life, the breath of it, the meaning of it, lay not within those walls, but in the threads that connected it to everywhere else. For centuries, European trade had flowed along certain channels, carved as much by habit and geography as by any conscious design. The great north-south routes through the Alpine passes, funneling goods from Italy upward into the German lands and beyond. The east-west corridors that connected the Mediterranean to the Baltic, the Atlantic to the distant reaches of the Hanseatic trade network. Augsburg sat at one of the crucial junctions, positioned along the road from Venice northward, from Nuremberg eastward, from Lyon westward. This was not accident. It was geography as destiny. The goods that moved through Augsburg were themselves the lifeblood of medieval and early modern commerce. Spices, first and foremost, pepper and cloves and nutmeg and cinnamon, shipped painstakingly from the Indies, preserved in their expensive weight, worth nearly their measure in silver because of the sheer miracle of their survival and arrival. These spices had travelled overland across Asia, through the hands of Arab merchants and Venetian middlemen, each taking their profit, each layer of hands making the final price in Augsburg dizzyingly high. A pound of pepper could cost as much as a day labourer made in months. But also textiles, Flanders wool and linen from various sources, dyed in places like Augsburg itself, then sent onward, and metals, the raw materials pulled from the earth, copper, silver, tin, iron, the substance of tools and weapons and coins and the structural bones of civilization, and then the goods of the south, wine from the Rhineland and beyond, oil, dried fruits, the precious products of Mediterranean agriculture. What made Augsburg's position so powerful was not that it produced all these things, but that it had learned to move them, to hold them, to connect the places that had them with the places that needed them. The guilds controlled the making, the merchants and the trading families controlled the moving, the timing, the information, the credit, the risk. And in that act of control lay the true source of wealth in the medieval and early modern world. Information itself was perhaps more valuable than physical goods. Which ships had arrived? Which routes were blocked? Where was silver scarce and therefore expensive? Where could you buy low and sell high? The merchant who knew these things first had everything. The merchant who could finance the journey, accepting the risk that a ship might sink or bandits might strike, who could extend credit across months and years, who could hold goods in warehouses waiting for prices to rise. This merchant held the world in a subtle grip. The fairs that punctuated the calendar year were extraordinary affairs, not shopping fairs as we might imagine them, but wholesale exchanges of staggering complexity. In particular, the fairs of Frankfurt and then later of Leipzig became the heartbeat of Central European commerce. Merchants would gather, representing their cities and their companies, and for a few weeks, the normal rules seemed to dissolve. Deals of enormous magnitude would be struck on mere handshakes and the witnessing of a crowd. Bills of exchange would be written, a kind of early credit instrument that allowed a merchant to pay for goods in one city by drawing on money held in another city, avoiding the terrible risk of transporting actual coins across bandit-infested roads. Augsburg merchants were already, by the middle 1400s, moving pieces across this board with increasing sophistication, but they were still primarily the vassal class of this world. Venice, to the south, had for centuries held the dominant position in Mediterranean trade, controlling the routes to and from the east. The Hanseatic League, that confederation of northern cities, held dominion over the Baltic and the northern routes. Nuremberg, Augsburg's rival to the east, was beginning its own rise. And yet something was shifting beneath the surface. The old certainties that had governed the medieval world, that trade should be limited by guild controls, that prices should be just, that profit itself was something to be regarded with moral suspicion by the church, that certain bloodlines and certain families held permanent and immutable positions in the hierarchy. All of these were beginning to crack under pressure. The printing press, though still new, was beginning to slowly alter the landscape of information. The Portuguese were pushing further down the African coast, seeking a route to the Indies that would bypass the Venetian and Arab middlemen entirely. The Ottoman Empire was consolidating power, and, while this disrupted some older trade routes, it also created new possibilities for the shrewd. Columbus was still alive, his voyages into the Atlantic still uncertain in outcome, but rumors of new worlds were beginning to percolate through merchant houses and royal courts. Augsburg, sitting at this threshold moment, was positioned like a town on a riverbank watching the water level rise. It had the guild structures, the trading infrastructure, the location, the labor force. What it lacked, what would transform it from a prosperous regional center into a power that could rival city-states and influence emperors, was a family willing to think bigger than anyone before them had thought. And that family was, very quietly, beginning to take shape. It is in the year 1406 that a man named Hans Fugger arrives in the city of Augsburg, though the exact circumstances of his departure from his homeland have grown soft with time, as most origin stories do. What we know, or believe we know with reasonable confidence, is that he came from Graben, a small settlement in the Swabian region to the south, and that he was a weaver by trade, a man who understood the patient, meditative work of interlocking threads into cloth. One can imagine him making this journey northward with perhaps a small amount of coin, knowledge of his craft, and something less tangible but perhaps more valuable, a hunger to transform his station, a hunger that would echo through his descendants for 200 years. Augsburg itself, at the turn of the 15th century, was becoming something more than it had been. It was not yet the merchant republic that Venice boasted of, nor did it hold the political weight of the imperial seats to the north, but it occupied a peculiar advantage on the map of Europe, a position that fate, or perhaps more accurately, geography, had granted it. The city sat at the convergence of ancient trade routes. From the south came merchants carrying spices and silks from the Mediterranean and beyond. traveling northward along the mountain passes toward the markets of Germany, Flanders, and the Baltic. From the east came the metals and amber of Central Europe. From the west came the manufactured goods and wool of the Rhine Valley. Augsburg, with its guilds already well established and its reputation for fair dealing, was becoming a natural meeting place, a crossroads where profit could be extracted not merely from the production of goods, but from the orchestration of their movement. Hans Fugger, arriving as a weaver, entered a city that still organized itself through its ancient guild structure, a system that had been in place for generations and showed no sign of losing its grip on the regulation of commerce. The guilds were powerful, protective, and conservative. They ensured that a man could practice his trade only if he belonged to the proper organization, only if he had served his apprenticeship, only if he had paid his fees and sworn his oaths. In some ways, they stifled innovation and limited competition. In other ways, they provided order, stability, and a form of quality assurance in an age where trust between distant merchants was difficult and costly to establish. But the guild system also created opportunity for those who could think beyond it, for those who could see that the real fortune was not necessarily in making cloth, but in moving it. What would have taken many lifetimes for a single weaver working at his loom, the accumulation of enough wealth to elevate his family, could potentially be accelerated through the movement of goods across greater distances and the taking of a small profit on each exchange. Hans Fugger, whether by temperament, by observation, or by simple necessity, began to understand this distinction. He did not abandon his knowledge of weaving, his understanding of what made good cloth, what the merchants wanted, what the nobles would pay for in their halls and their ceremonies. Rather, he layered upon it a new skill, the ability to source, to broker, to connect the seller with the buyer, and to extract value from that connection. The city of Augsburg at this moment was home to perhaps 20,000 souls, a respectable size for the period, yet small enough that a man of enterprise could know the important figures, could move through its streets and markets and counting houses with purpose, could make himself known to the families of consequence who were themselves engaged in the expansion of trade. The civic government of Augsburg, unlike some other German cities, was not entirely dominated by the hereditary nobility. Instead, it operated as a merchant republic of sorts, governed by a council of the wealthy and established families, men who made their fortunes through commerce, and who understood that the prosperity of the city created the circumstances for their own accumulation. This was an important distinction. In such a place, a talented outsider with connections and capital could, over time, move from the margins toward the center. Hans Fugger's weaving knowledge became his credential, his entry point into a world of trust. He could judge quality. He could spot a shoddy weave from across a room. He could assess whether the linen being offered by a merchant was genuine Flemish work or merely a clever imitation. These skills, in an age of limited standardization and abundant fraud, were genuinely valuable. Gradually, his business shifted. He began to acquire cloth from various producers in the region, from local weavers, from workshops in the surrounding villages, from suppliers in the north, and he began to sell it to merchants who were themselves shipping goods across longer distances into the markets of Italy, of Hungary, of the Low Countries. One can picture the modest growth of this enterprise. A few bolts of cloth one season becoming 10 bolts the next, a transaction that yielded a small profit becoming the capital for a slightly larger transaction. Partnerships forming with other merchants in Augsburg who saw in Hans Fugger a man who kept his word, who understood the goods he was moving, and who had the energy and acumen to make things happen. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of story that wars are fought over or that monuments are built to commemorate, but it was the kind of slow, grinding accumulation that built the deep foundations of dynasties. What is worth noting, though it may seem a small matter, is that Hans Fugger married well. His wife came from a merchant family of some standing in Augsburg, and this marriage, in addition to whatever personal affection or regard may have existed between them, about which history remains entirely silent, created a network of connections, of shared interests, of family obligations that would help to anchor his growing enterprise within the social fabric of the city. When one married into the family of another merchant, one did not marry merely a person. One married their connections, their reputation, their knowledge of which suppliers could be trusted, and which customers paid promptly, and which ventures were promising. Through the closing decades of the 14th century and into the opening years of the 15th, Hans Fugger's business expanded in scope, though not in the spectacular way that later generations would manage. He was building something more gradual and more stable, a reputation. He was becoming one of the merchants of Augsburg, not yet the most prominent, but someone whose name was known, someone to whom business could be conducted, someone whose word could be relied upon. And in the medieval world, where communication was slow and written contracts were both expensive and unreliable, reputation was perhaps the most valuable commodity a merchant could possess. He had children who lived into adulthood, which was no small matter in an age of plague and recurring mortality. He trained them, implicitly and explicitly, in the lessons he had learned through his own ascent. The importance of knowing your goods, of honoring your commitments, of building relationships that transcended any single transaction. He was planting, in other words, not merely a business, but a way of thinking about business. He was establishing principles and practices that would allow his descendants to expand far beyond what he himself could achieve, using the foundation he laid as a platform for still greater ambitions. By the time Hans Fugger died, in the year 1410, he had transformed himself from a weaver into a merchant, from a man with a single craft into a man who understood the circulation of goods across a widening geography. He had accumulated wealth, significant wealth for a man of his origins, though not yet the kind of wealth that would make princes hesitate before making decisions. But more importantly, he had planted something less tangible and more enduring. He had shown his family a path, had demonstrated that through intelligence, diligence, and the careful cultivation of connections, it was possible to move upward in the world, to build something that would outlast oneself, to transform one generation's modest prosperity into the next generation's foundation for greater ambitions still. The fingers that had once pulled wool through a loom began, over decades, to trace roots on parchment instead. Hans Fugger's greatest insight, and perhaps the one that would transform his descendants from respectable artisans to something altogether different, was understanding that the real profit lay not in making cloth, but in knowing where cloth was needed, who wanted it, and what they might trade for it in return. It was a quiet realization, the kind that settles into a mind gradually, like evening light across a workshop floor. By the time Hans passed his enterprise to his sons in the 1450s, Augsburg itself had begun to shift. The great trade routes that threaded through southern Germany were widening, deepening, becoming more complex. Silk from the Levant, wool from the Low Countries, spices from the East, their prices fluctuating wildly depending on how war and weather disrupted the journeys of merchant ships. A weaver who could merely produce cloth was no longer enough. A merchant who could sense these patterns, who could position himself at the intersection of supply and need, had room to grow in ways that looms could never offer. The Fugger brothers, Lucas, Andreas, and eventually others who would follow, began, perhaps tentatively at first, to think not as manufacturers but as traders. Imagine the mental shift required. For generations, your family's wealth had been tied to your own hands, your workshop, the hours your apprentices labored. Now you were asked to trust that wealth could bloom through correspondence, through careful arrangements with distant strangers, through the patient art of knowing what would be scarce in Venice next spring, or what copper might cost in Krakow by autumn. Augsburg's position, it must be said, was extraordinarily fortunate. Nestled where the Lech and Vertach rivers converged, the city sat like a spider at the center of a web of roots. To the north lay the German lands, rich in metals and timber. To the south, the Alpine passes opened toward Italy and the Venetian republics that controlled Mediterranean trade. To the east sprawled Hungary and Bohemia, their mountains heavy with silver and copper. To the west lay the Rhine valleys and the Low Countries, themselves bursting with merchants and moneylenders who had grown fat on cloth commerce and banking. The Fuggers did something that, in retrospect, seems almost obvious, yet required considerable courage and vision to attempt. They began to establish what we might call trading posts, or branches of their operation, in these key locations. A representative in Venice, another in the Tyrol near the silver mines, perhaps a connection in Krakow. These were not grand establishments, certainly not at first. Often they were simply trusted family members, or carefully selected employees who could watch, listen, learn what goods were moving, which prices were rising, which merchants were struggling with debt. Information, in those days before newspapers or postal services, was itself a commodity more precious than many realized. What strikes us, as we consider this expansion from the vantage point of sleep, is how utterly dependent it was on trust and reputation. A Fugger agent in a distant city was, in essence, the family's eyes and hands. If he made poor judgments, if he squandered money on bad trades, if he was dishonest, the family's entire enterprise could be wounded. This meant that the Fuggers, from their earliest ventures into long-distance trade, had to think not merely about transactions, but about people. They needed to select their representatives carefully, establish clear expectations, and develop systems, however primitive, to verify that distant hands were not betraying their interests. One can almost see these systems being born, sketched onto parchment, refined through trial and costly error. Regular letters between the center in Augsburg and the branches, detailed accounts of what was bought and sold, requests for information about local conditions, shifting alliances, the reliability of other merchants they might trade with. These were early steps towards something that would later define the Fugger advantage, the ability to process and act on information faster than competitors who were still locked into the old ways of doing business. The shift from weaving to trading was not a sudden rupture, but rather a gradual tilting of the family's attention and resources. The looms did not disappear overnight. There were still cloth merchants in the Fugger operation decades later, but the emotional center of the enterprise, the part that kept the brightest minds awake at night planning and calculating, began to move away from the clatter of the workshop toward the quieter intensity of the counting house, where quills scratched across paper and ambition could be measured not in bolts of fabric, but in the breadth of an empire of exchange. Consider what this required of the human imagination. To thrive in this new world, you had to hold in your mind, simultaneously, multiple markets separated by mountains and weeks of travel time. You had to sense the rhythms of harvest and commerce, the way that a poor grain harvest in Bavaria might affect the price of linen, which might make Italian merchants more likely to invest in Portuguese wine shipments instead, which might alter the value of currency exchanges in a way that benefited whoever was positioned correctly. It was a form of three-dimensional chess, played across an entire continent, with moves that unfolded over months and years. The Fuggers, by all accounts, had a gift for this kind of thinking. Whether it was innate or learned is impossible to say, probably some mixture of both. But there was something in the family character that inclined them to see possibilities where others saw only their immediate surroundings. A merchant in most towns looked at what was in front of him, his shop, his immediate customers, his relationships with a few trusted suppliers. A Fugger began to ask different questions. What if we positioned ourselves not as a supplier to local needs, but as a connector between regions? What if we could move goods along routes that others were not yet fully exploiting? What if we could offer services, credit, reliable information, secure transport, that merchants in various places would pay for? These questions, once asked, could not be unasked. They opened possibilities that began to reshape the family's destiny. And as the 1460s and 1470s progressed, as the brothers worked to expand their web of connections, Augsburg itself seemed to recognize what was happening. The quiet weaver family was becoming something more. Word began to spread through the merchant communities of Europe, tentatively, cautiously at first, then with growing certainty, that there were men in Augsburg who understood trade in a new way, who could move goods and money across impossible distances, who might be trusted with ventures that others would deem too risky or too complex. The threads they were weaving now were not made of wool or silk, but of relationship and calculation, of information and opportunity. And like any weaver, they were learning that the strength of the final cloth depended on how carefully you had threaded the loom, how precise your tension, how patient your hand. By the time Hans Fugger's sons came of age in those opening decades of the 15th century, the family's small cloth enterprise had already begun to hum with a quiet, deliberate energy. The sons inherited not just a business, but a question: what lay beyond the borders of Augsburg, and what could be gained by the merchant who dared to step beyond them? One of these sons, Jakob the Elder, born around 1398, would become the architect of something far larger than his father's modest operation. He would be the one to sense that textiles alone, no matter how finely woven, could not build an empire. He would be the one to understand that a family's future lay not in the looms themselves, but in the networks those looms could weave across the continent. Jakob the Elder spent his formative years learning what his father had taught him, but he learned it with an restless eye, always searching for the next connection, the next opening. The cloth trade of medieval Augsburg was not some isolated affair, tucked away in a provincial corner. It was already threaded into the greater tapestry of European commerce. Flemish wool, Italian dyes, Hungarian metals, these goods moved along roads that connected kingdoms, and a merchant with the right connections could position himself at the intersections where value flowed like water seeking its level. Jakob understood this deeply. He understood that fortunes were not made by selling what everyone else sold, but by controlling the pathways through which goods moved, by becoming indispensable to that movement. In the decades after 1420 or so, Jakob the Elder began to expand the family's reach beyond cloth into something more ambitious: the trading of all manner of goods across the widening networks of European commerce. Textiles remained the foundation, yes, but he added layer upon layer to the enterprise. Spices from the Mediterranean, metals from the mountains, wool from Flanders and England. The Fugger firm became not a single thread but a loom that could weave multiple colors simultaneously. And as the reach expanded, so too did something else entirely: the question of how to finance all this movement, all this buying and selling and transporting of goods across such vast distances. Here is where Jakob the Elder's vision truly separated itself from his predecessor's modest ambitions. Around mid-century, the family began to move into what we might call proto-banking activities, though the distinction between merchant and banker was far blurrier in those days than it would later become. When a Fugger representative needed to send money from Augsburg to Venice, he did not simply pack silver coins onto a mule. He used letters of exchange, pieces of paper that represented value, that could be traded and settled through the networks of merchant houses scattered across Europe. These letters of exchange were, in essence, an early form of what we would recognize as banking instruments. The Fuggers became not just traders in goods, but facilitators of the movement of capital itself. This distinction, subtle as it might seem to a modern ear, represented something revolutionary. Jakob the Elder was learning what would become the Fugger family's greatest secret: that money itself could be a commodity, that credit could be extended and repaid, that the spread between what you lent and what you were owed could itself become a source of wealth separate from the buying and selling of cloth or spices. This was a delicate insight, one that required not just mathematical acuity, but also a kind of financial intuition, an ability to judge character and creditworthiness, to sense when a merchant could be trusted with capital and when the risk was too great. The accumulation of capital through textiles and early trading ventures gave Jakob the Elder something precious, a foundation of trust. The Fuggers became known not as reckless adventurers, but as prudent, reliable partners in commerce. They kept their ledgers with meticulous care, they honored their debts, they paid their weavers and suppliers on time. In a world where commercial relationships were often shadowed by suspicion and fraud, the Fugger name began to carry weight, and as that weight accumulated, doors began to open that would have been closed to a mere weaver's grandson. By the time Jakob the Elder reached his later years, the family business had transformed fundamentally. The profits from cloth and trade had been reinvested not merely in larger stocks of goods, but in the infrastructure of commerce itself, in agents and representatives scattered across Europe, in ledgers and record-keeping systems, in the gradual building of what might be called a multinational trading enterprise, centuries before that term would be invented. Imagine, if you will, a nervous energy that runs through the Fugger counting houses, a sense that something larger is crystallizing, that the threads being gathered now will soon be woven into something that no one in Augsburg quite dares yet to name aloud. The wealth that Jakob the Elder accumulated was significant, certainly enough to place the family among the wealthiest in Augsburg, perhaps even among the most prominent merchant families in all of southern Germany. Yet his accumulation was methodical, almost conservative in its steadiness. He did not spend extravagantly. He did not seek the ostentation that sometimes drew the ire of envious neighbors or the suspicion of the church. Instead, he reinvested constantly, always pushing the money back into the business, always expanding the networks, always teaching his sons, particularly his son Georg, what he had learned about the hidden mathematics of commerce. And there was another element, perhaps harder to quantify but no less important. Jakob the Elder was building something like a reputation for sagacity, for an almost uncanny ability to read the currents of European trade and position himself ahead of them. By the early decades of the 16th century, as he entered his later years, the family was on the cusp of something far greater than mere wealth. The foundations had been laid, the capital had been accumulated, the networks had been woven. All that remained was for the right person, someone with his intelligence, his education, and his ambition, to take what Jakob the Elder had built and transform it into something that would echo across the centuries. That person was already alive, already being groomed for his role. His name was Jakob too, and history would call him Jakob Fugger the Rich. By the middle of the 15th century, the Fugger name had begun to carry weight in Augsburg's merchant circles, yet it was still a family of comfortable means rather than towering fortune. The textiles business Jakob the Elder had nurtured remained solid, productive, a foundation of steady profit. But foundations, however sturdy, do not build empires. It would take a younger man, one born into privilege enough to imagine something larger, to see what the family might become. That man was Jakob Fugger, known eventually as Jakob the Rich, though in his youth he bore no such title, only possibility, and an appetite for understanding that burned quietly beneath the surface of his merchant's upbringing. Jakob was born in 1459, the youngest of 4 sons, and perhaps it was this position in the family constellation that freed him to think differently. The oldest sons were already embedded in the family trades, their paths laid with careful precision. Jakob, arriving late into a household already content with its station, was given something that money alone could not secure: time to learn, to travel, to become educated in ways his elder brothers had not needed to be. And the family, recognizing something restless and keen in this youngest boy, decided on a path that would reshape everything they were about to become. They sent him, at an age when most apprentices were just learning to count their father's coins, to Venice. Imagine, if you will, the journey itself. Jakob Fugger, departing Augsburg in the early 1470s, perhaps around 14 or 15 years old, traveling south through the Alpine passes with merchants' caravans, the air growing warmer, the landscape softening from stone to green valleys. And then, finally, the Adriatic, Venice rising from the water like something half real, half dream, a city of canals and merchant galleys, of warehouses stacked with spices and silk from the Orient, of bankers and traders from every corner of the known world conducting business in 1,000 different tongues. It was in many ways the financial capital of Europe, the place where the mathematics of money had been refined to an art form. The Fuggers had connections in Venice, as successful merchant families did, and Jakob was apprenticed into those networks. But what made his years there different from those of a typical merchant's son was his own inclination toward precision and understanding. Venice in the 1470s was not merely a market, it was a school. The Venetian merchants had spent centuries perfecting the instruments of trade, bills of exchange, double-entry bookkeeping, the careful calculation of risk across great distances. They understood, in ways that most of Northern Europe had not yet grasped, that money itself could be a commodity. You could earn profit not simply by buying cloth cheaper and selling it dear, but by lending money at interest, by financing voyages, by carefully managing the flow of capital across great distances and calculating the precise angle of risk and return. Young Jakob absorbed this with an intensity that bordered on hunger. The records suggest he spent roughly 10 years in Venice, learning not just the language of commerce, but something deeper, the philosophy of it, the way a skilled banker could read the currents of empire and position himself within them. He learned to calculate, to read ledgers written in the Venetian style, to understand the music of transactions, and perhaps more importantly, he learned to think in networks. Venice taught him that wealth was not merely accumulated in one place, like coins in a vault, but flowed like water through channels connecting distant markets. If you could understand those channels, position yourself within them, direct that flow, you could build something far larger than any one transaction could produce. There is a quietness to learning that rarely gets spoken of, the daily repetition of accounts, the slow understanding of pattern and principle, the moment when what seemed like chaos resolves into structure. In Venice, young Jakob experienced that quietness. He studied, he worked, he watched the great merchants navigate the complexities of financing crusades and funding long voyages to the east. He saw how a banker's letter could move value across the Mediterranean without a single coin changing hands, how trust and mathematics could accomplish what heavy gold could not. And somewhere in those long afternoons in Venetian counting houses, he began to understand his calling. When Jakob finally returned to Augsburg in the early 1480s, he was no longer the youngest Fugger son. He was a man in his 20s, trained in the highest mathematics of commerce, carrying with him not just experience but a vision. His father Jakob the Elder was aging. His older brothers were managing the family's existing textile trade, but they thought, perhaps, in the old patterns. Jakob thought differently. He had seen in Venice what was possible when a family positioned itself not as mere traders in goods, but as intermediaries of capital itself. He had felt the power that came from understanding the machinery beneath the surface of commerce. What began to form in his mind though not yet spoken aloud, was a transformation. The Fugger family would not simply buy and sell textiles. They would become bankers. They would lend money to princes. They would finance the great explorations and the great conflicts of their age. They would position themselves at the exact intersection where money, politics, and power met. But all of that was still ahead. For now, Jakob carried his Venice knowledge like a seed, and the family business, still textile, still local, seemed almost to hum with potential, waiting for the right moment to change its shape entirely. The path from silk and wool into the deep earth of European mountains was not a sudden leap, but rather a slow turning of the mind toward what lay beneath. As the Fugger name grew stronger in the merchant halls of Augsburg, as their ledgers filled with smaller and smaller profits from the weaving trade, for even the finest cloth, you might have noticed, yields only modest margins when so many hands compete for the same bolt, Jakob Fugger the Rich began to perceive something that his predecessors had sensed only dimly. The truest wealth, perhaps, did not rest in the patterns woven into linen. It lay deeper. It lay in the stone. By the middle years of the 15th century, when Jakob was already in his maturity and had returned from his years of apprenticeship in Venice with a mind sharpened by ledgers and currency exchanges, the minds of the Tyrol and Hungary were calling to anyone with capital enough to answer. These were not the narrow, desperate pits of earlier centuries, where men dug with primitive tools and prayer. The technology of mining had evolved. Drainage systems, chains of buckets and simple mechanical pumps now allowed miners to sink deeper than before, to follow veins of silver and copper down into the dark, where they twisted and branched like the roots of some vast buried tree. And the metals that came forth were themselves a form of currency. Silver and copper were not luxuries subject to the whims of fashion. They were essential. They were wanted everywhere. Here lay the opportunity that would transform the Fugger fortune from substantial into extraordinary. Jakob understood what many wealth builders in his time had not quite grasped, that by moving upstream in the production of goods, by owning not the looms but the materials that others would use in their looms, not the shops where fabric sold but the mines where the metals were extracted, a family could establish a kind of gravity. Everything would flow toward them. The timing, too, was fortunate. The major mining operations in those regions were owned largely by regional nobility and bishops, men of old wealth who had inherited their privileges but often lacked the capital to develop their holdings fully. They saw the mountains beneath their feet as a source of coins to spend, not as assets to be developed with systematic investment. Fugger recognized where others saw only difficulty. Where a landowner saw the enormous expense of draining a flooded mine shaft, Jakob saw the opportunity to finance that expense in exchange for a percentage of the production. Where a bishop saw the chaos of dozens of miners working with different techniques, Fugger saw the possibility of organization, of systematic efficiency, of records kept in his own hand so that he would always know, to the last penny, what was being extracted. By the 1790s, forgive me, the 1490s, for time moves strangely when one speaks of centuries long past, the Fuggers had begun acquiring shares and rights to mines in the Tyrol. This was done often through loans, an early example of what would become their signature method. They would offer to finance the expansion of a mine, the purchase of new equipment, the wages for more workers, in exchange for a contract guaranteeing them a portion of the silver and copper output, month after month, year after year. It was a gentle entanglement. The mine owner received his capital without having to sell the land itself. The Fugger received a stream of precious metals flowing into his warehouses in Augsburg as steadily as rain falling into a basin. The Hungarian mines proved even richer. In those eastern mountains, the earth seemed almost willing to give up its treasures. Copper especially came forth in quantities that astonished even the Fuggers' own expectations. Soon the family was not merely one player among many in the mining trade. They had become something closer to the central nervous system of Central European metal production. If you wanted to buy copper in quantities large enough to matter, you went to the Fuggers. If you wanted to finance a mine, you went to the Fuggers. If you wanted to know the price of silver in the next season, you asked what the Fuggers were paying. And as the metals flowed out of the earth, as they were processed and distributed across the networks that the Fuggers had woven across half of Europe, a curious transformation occurred. The family's wealth stopped being merely large. It became structural. It became essential to the functioning of kingdoms. You see, once you control the supply of metals, the raw material from which coins are struck, the substance from which the blood of commerce flows, you have moved beyond being simply rich. You have become something closer to a function. You have become, in the most literal sense, a pillar that holds up the architecture of the realm itself. It was in these mountain mines, in the organized extraction of these precious elements, that the true mechanism of the Fugger ascendancy was forged. Everything that would follow, the loans to emperors, the influence over elections, the slow accumulation of power so vast that it seemed to transcend mere money, all of this had its roots here, in the mud and stone and darkness, in the systematic organization of desperate labor under the careful gaze of Augsburg accountants who recorded every ounce of metal with the precision of men counting beads in a rosary. The deeper Jakob reached into the earth, the higher his family would rise. To understand the true scale of what the Fuggers built, we must descend, at least in imagination, into the mines themselves. Picture the mountains of Tyrol in the late 15th century, where the Fuggers had secured their first mining contracts. The earth there was rich with copper and silver, but the earth does not yield its treasures without asking everything of those who would claim them. The mines were not the mechanized caverns we might imagine. They were instead networks of hand-carved shafts and passages, some barely wider than a man's shoulders, descending into darkness so complete that torches made only small islands of flickering light. And yet these primitive holes in the mountain produced wealth on a scale that would reshape European finance. How did men, armed with nothing but pickaxes and determination, transform raw ore into the currency of empires? The process began with the miners themselves, often peasants, who had little choice in their labor, but found in mining at least the possibility of payment rather than serfdom. They would descend before dawn, their candles casting shadows that seemed to dance against the stone walls, their hammers striking in rhythms that echoed upward through miles of tunnel. The work was dangerous, in ways that are difficult for us to comprehend now. Collapses happened. Gas accumulated in pockets and suffocated men silently. Water seeped in and turned shafts into drowning chambers. And yet they continued, day after day, because the contract had been signed and the Fugger representatives came regularly to count the output and calculate the debt. The ore itself presented its own puzzle. Silver and copper were not found in pure veins waiting to be plucked from the stone. Instead, the miners extracted heavy rock that contained only traces of the precious metals, often mixed with compounds that had to be separated through process and patience. This is where the second layer of the mining operation began, the part that took the raw material and transformed it into something the merchants of Augsburg could trade. Smelting operations sprawled across the valleys near the mines, their furnaces burning continuously, requiring enormous quantities of wood to maintain temperatures hot enough to melt ore. The logistics of this alone were staggering. Where would all that wood come from? And how would it be transported to the furnaces without depleting entire forests? The Fuggers, with their merchant's eye, understood that control of the forests themselves was as important as control of the mines. They secured timber rights across vast territories. Teams of workers would fell trees, transport logs by sledge in winter when the snow made movement easier, and stack them carefully near the smelting sites. The forest became a resource to be managed with the same precision that one might manage a counting house. The smelters themselves were skilled workers, occupying a peculiar middle status between common miners and the merchant class. They understood, through accumulated knowledge passed down across generations, how to coax the metals from their rocky prisons. The furnaces required constant attention, constant feeding, constant adjustment. Too much heat and materials were wasted. Too little, and the ore remained stubbornly solid. The smelter's judgment, his intuition developed over years of watching fire and stone interact, was irreplaceable. The Fuggers valued these men highly, paying them premiums to keep them from moving to rival operations, ensuring that the family's holdings retained the most efficient extraction rates. Once the metal had been purified, it faced yet another obstacle, the matter of transport. Copper and silver are heavy. Moving them across medieval roads, over alpine passes, down to the valleys where trade routes connected to the rivers and merchant highways of Central Europe, required coordination that we might call almost miraculous. The Fuggers developed networks of pack animals, negotiated safe passage with local lords and bandits alike, and established way stations where goods could be rested and protected. They understood that the value of ore mined meant nothing if it could not reach the markets where it would be transformed into money. And there was another layer still, one that revealed the true genius of the Fugger operation. They did not simply sell raw metals. They began to engage in what we might call vertical integration, centuries before that term would be invented. The Fuggers invested in minting facilities. They financed goldsmiths and metalworkers who could craft the ore into coins, jewelry, and goods that had value in the eyes of princes and merchants across Europe. A lump of silver sitting in Tyrol had one worth. That same silver, minted into coins bearing the imperial seal or fashioned into fine plate, had another worth entirely, and often a much greater one. The whole apparatus, when you stepped back and observed it, was a machine for transforming labor and stone into liquidity. And liquidity, in the hands of a family as shrewd as the Fuggers, was power. This is why they invested so heavily in the mines. This is why they endured the costs and the risks. They were not simply extracting metals, they were extracting the capacity to finance princes, to move markets, to reshape the economic landscape of Europe through the patient accumulation and strategic deployment of precious metals and the wealth those metals represented. The medieval miner, swinging his pickaxe in the darkness, was unknowingly contributing to a structure that would eventually affect kingdoms and the decisions of popes. He did not know it. He knew only the cold stone, the weight of his tool, the hope of payment at week's end. But the Fuggers knew. They could see the entire chain, from the deepest shaft to the counting house in Augsburg, and they had learned to orchestrate it like a symphony, extracting harmony from the coordination of thousands of lives and an intricate dance of geography, technology, and human ambition. The world, by the late 15th century, had begun to understand something that Jakob Fugger grasped almost intuitively, that money, when accumulated in sufficient quantity and wielded with sufficient patience, could reshape the very architecture of power itself. The Habsburg dynasty, rising steadily across the fragmented territories of Central Europe, possessed vast lands and legitimate claims to succession, but they faced a problem that no amount of military strength or ancestral prestige could solve. They needed ready capital. They needed it urgently, and they needed it in quantities that would have seemed unimaginable to earlier generations of princes. This is where the Fuggers entered, not as servants exactly, but as something more complicated, partners, in an arrangement that would bind the fate of a merchant family to the fate of an imperial dynasty for generations to come. The relationship was not born from ideology or sentiment. It was born from mathematics. Consider the machinery of imperial debt as it developed between Augsburg and Vienna. A Habsburg prince, let us say, sought to consolidate territories or defend borders. Armies required funding. Mercenaries demanded payment in silver, not in future promises or prayers. The imperial treasury, fed by feudal revenues and trade taxes, could rarely produce such sums quickly enough. The solution was elegant and ruthless. Borrow from the Fuggers, pledge future revenues as collateral, and pay interest that would ensure the Fuggers grew wealthier with each passing year of repayment. Some historians suggest that by the early 16th century, the Habsburgs were spending nearly 30% of their income servicing Fugger loans. Can you imagine the weight of that obligation? Year after year, decade after decade, the machinery grinding forward, interest accruing like snow accumulating on a winter mountain. Jakob Fugger the Rich understood something that would become a central truth of modern finance, that a lender could possess more genuine power than the crowned heads who formerly ruled. He did not need to wear a crown. He did not need to command soldiers. His power lay in the simple fact that when the Habsburg emperor required funds to maintain his empire, there was only one merchant house in all of Christendom with sufficient reserves to provide them without requiring lengthy negotiation or dangerous delay. This was monopoly, though the term would not be formally understood for centuries more. The Fuggers established a formal banking presence in Vienna, a kind of financial embassy embedded within the imperial court itself. Through this office flowed the careful accounting of debts and credits, the documentation of loans and repayments, the endless paper and parchment that translated the abstract concept of obligation into something concrete and enforceable. The Fuggers kept meticulous records. This is crucial to understand, because records were power. A man might dispute a promise made in conversation. He might claim forgetfulness or misunderstanding. But a ledger, maintained by trained scribes using double-entry bookkeeping, a ledger with figures that balanced and cross-checked and could be audited by independent witnesses, this was something against which even an emperor found it difficult to argue. The Fuggers, in their counting houses, held the true imperial treasury in the form of knowledge, of accurate accounting, of information that no one else possessed with such precision and completeness. The arrangement benefited both parties, though not equally. The Habsburgs gained access to capital they could not otherwise secure, allowing them to pursue their dynastic ambitions, to field armies, to maintain their expanding court and bureaucracy. The Fuggers, in return, gained something far more valuable than mere interest payments. They gained influence. They gained access. They gained the ear of princes who, in desperation, were willing to grant them trading privileges, tax exemptions, mining concessions, the raw materials and commercial freedom that would allow their wealth to compound not just through lending, but through the actual production and trade of goods. There is a quality to this relationship worth sitting with for a moment. Power, in medieval and early modern Europe, had traditionally been understood as something tied directly to land and heredity. Kings ruled because their ancestors had conquered or been granted territory. The Fuggers possessed no ancestral claim to rule, no army, no castle walls. Yet by the early 16th century, they could send an agent to Vienna or Brussels or Antwerp, and that agent would be received by princes and bishops and imperial administrators with a level of deference normally reserved for nobility. Why? Because those agents carried something invisible but tangible: access to capital, the ability to say yes or no to requests that could determine the fate of kingdoms. The relationship also introduced a kind of structural tension into European politics that had not existed in quite the same way before. Monarchs, by their nature, chafed at dependence. A king does not enjoy being beholden to a merchant family, no matter how necessary that dependence might be. This created a persistent anxiety in Habsburg circles, a quiet knowledge that someday, if the Fuggers chose, they could simply refuse the next loan. They could, in theory, allow the empire to collapse under the weight of its own obligations. This threat was never spoken aloud, but it existed in the soft space between respectful negotiation and genuine fear. And yet, and this too deserves reflection, the Fuggers had their own vulnerability embedded in this relationship. An emperor facing bankruptcy might simply repudiate his debts. Monarchs possessed a kind of power that transcended legality. They could declare a debt invalid, seize Fugger assets, expel the family from their territories. The arrangement held together because both parties understood that destruction of the relationship would harm both sides, but the Habsburgs always possessed a brutal option that the Fuggers did not. This asymmetry, though often obscured by the polite language of negotiation and contract, haunted every transaction between Augsburg and Vienna. By lending to emperors, the Fuggers had elevated themselves into a new tier of European power, but they had also woven their fate inextricably into the fate of a dynasty that, though powerful, was not immortal. Their rise to unimaginable wealth was inseparable from Habsburg ambitions, from imperial warfare, from the endless competition for territory and legitimacy that characterized the age. As long as the Habsburgs needed money, the Fuggers would remain essential. But what would happen if circumstances changed? What would happen if, someday, the Habsburgs found other sources of capital, or if their star began to fade? These questions, for now, still lay in the future, visible only to those with the capacity to imagine beyond the golden present that Jakob Fugger was constructing around himself. And so we arrive at a moment when history pivoted on something so delicate, so carefully hidden, that most who lived through it never quite understood the architecture beneath the crown. In the year 1519, the Holy Roman Empire faced a succession unlike any before it. The aging Emperor Maximilian had left no clear heir, and across the fragmented kingdoms and principalities of Europe, ambitious men began to stir. There were Spanish claims, Portuguese claims, French claims. The electors, those select princes and bishops who held the power to crown an emperor, found themselves suddenly courted by every powerful house from Milan to Cologne, each offering promises and gold, whispers of favor and threats, delivered in the softest possible tones. Among the candidates stood a young prince, only 19 years old, the grandson of Maximilian himself. His name was Charles of Ghent, born in Burgundy, heir to the Spanish throne through his mother, and possessed of fragmented claims that no one quite believed could coalesce into actual power. Against him stood King Francis I of France, young and ambitious, and far more experienced in the arts of statecraft. Francis had every advantage. He had territory, he had armies, he had the weight of a kingdom that men respected. By every measure of that age, Charles seemed unlikely, almost peripheral to the true contest. And yet there existed in Augsburg, in the carefully maintained ledgers of the Fugger family, a calculation that would reshape everything. Jakob Fugger the Rich had spent decades building not merely a merchant enterprise, but something far more sophisticated, a network of credit so extensive, so strategically placed, that it had become impossible for emperors and kings to move without touching Fugger money at some crucial point. This was not crude bribery, though bribery certainly occurred. Rather, it was something more elegant. It was financial architecture. The Fuggers had extended loans and credit to half the German princes. They financed church appointments. They held mortgages on territories. They were woven so thoroughly into the fabric of power that power had begun to depend on them. When Charles's representatives approached Jakob Fugger, and one must imagine this was done with extraordinary discretion, perhaps through intermediaries, perhaps through written correspondence carried by trusted messengers, they were asking for something unprecedented. They needed enough gold to sway the electors. They needed it openly enough that the princes would understand that real resources stood behind this candidacy, yet quietly enough that it would not appear as naked purchase of the crown. Historians have debated the exact figures across the centuries, for the Fuggers were careful about what they recorded and how, but the consensus has settled somewhere in the range of 250,000 florins, an incomprehensible sum, enough to outfit armies, enough to build cities, enough to purchase loyalty in a world where loyalty was, ultimately, a commodity. The question that lingers, suspended in the archives like pollen in candlelight, is why did Jakob Fugger make this choice? He was already immensely wealthy. He already wielded enormous influence. What could drive him to risk such a staggering sum on a candidate who seemed destined to lose? The most likely answer, though it exists slightly in shadow, is rooted in pragmatism rather than ideology. The Fuggers had already begun their expansion into mining operations in Central Europe. Charles, as Holy Roman Emperor, would control the territories where those mines operated. Charles, moreover, came from the Burgundian Spanish houses that were themselves becoming increasingly powerful and increasingly reliant on credit. A French emperor under Francis would have looked northward to threaten the Fuggers' operations. A Habsburg emperor under Charles would look southward, toward the Mediterranean and the Spanish kingdoms. For Jakob Fugger, this was not philanthropy. It was an investment in future dominion over the machinery of imperial finance. What happened next unfolded with quiet precision. The gold flowed. The electors were approached. Some received loans. Some received direct gifts that were recorded vaguely enough to preserve dignity. Some simply understood that the Fuggers' backing meant that this candidacy was backed by real economic power, and in an age when economics and politics were not yet cleanly separated, this was something substantial. The princes in the Electoral College began to shift, one by one, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes with apparent conviction. They came to understand that Charles was actually viable, and on the 28th of June, 1519, they cast their votes. Charles of Ghent was elected Holy Roman Emperor, unifying under a single crown the vast, scattered, almost unimaginably complex collection of territories that made up the German-speaking lands, Austria, Spain, the Netherlands, and the colonies Spain was acquiring in the Americas. Francis I of France was left to contemplate what had happened. He had possessed every conventional advantage, and yet he had lost. What he could not see clearly, because such things were designed not to be seen, was that Jakob Fugger had tilted the board ever so slightly, and that had been enough. The banker had not created Charles's destiny. The young prince brought legitimacy and claimed that Francis could never match, but Fugger had made it possible. He had provided the platform of gold upon which a new emperor could stand. And here we might pause and consider what this moment meant, not for empires, but for the nature of power itself. In the medieval world, power had flowed downward from God through kings and princes, or so the theory held. But by the early 16th century, something new was stirring. Capital was beginning to hold its own conversation with sovereignty. The Fuggers did not rule. They never claimed to rule. They did not command armies or pass laws. And yet, in the quiet moment when the electors cast their votes, they had moved history. An entire continent and its future had tilted, because a merchant family in Augsburg had chosen to place their accumulated wealth at the service of one vision of Europe rather than another. The emperor did not owe the Fuggers gratitude, though gratitude came. Rather, he owed them something more binding, the understanding that his empire would now have to serve, in countless small and large ways, the interests that had made his throne possible. This was not corruption in the crude sense. It was simply how the world was becoming. Power was beginning to need capital to function, and whoever controlled the largest pools of capital would, by that control alone, shape which powers rose and which fell. And so the Fuggers accumulated their vast ledgers, their parchment and ink growing thicker by the year, yet this accumulation alone would not have made them masters of European finance. There was something quieter at work, something almost invisible to those who watched them from a distance, something that lived in the very way they recorded what they owned and what they owed. This something had a name, though most merchants in those days did not yet know it by heart. It was called double-entry bookkeeping, and it would become the secret architecture upon which their empire stood. Picture, if you will, a moment in Venice in the 14th century, where merchants from across the Mediterranean had gathered not merely to trade goods, but to trade knowledge. In this city of waterways and glass and impossible mathematics, a system of recording had taken root and begun to grow. The idea was deceptively simple, yet revolutionary. Instead of writing down what you gained in one place and what you lost in another, a merchant could now record the same transaction twice, from two different angles, as if looking at the same moment from opposite mirrors. On one side of the ledger, you would write what you received. On the other, what you gave. A sale became not simply a line of income, but a dance between two equal and opposite entries, forever bound together in the geometry of balance. When Jakob Fugger the Rich travelled to Venice in his youth, he did not go merely to learn the secrets of trade, though certainly those fascinated him. He went to absorb this new language of numbers, this way of seeing a merchant house as something that could be perfectly known through careful accounting. The Venetians had already understood that if you could see your finances with absolute clarity, you could manipulate them with precision. You could hide nothing from yourself. Every loan, every investment, every shift of capital would reveal itself through the pattern of your entries. And so Jakob returned to Augsburg, carrying this knowledge like a seed, and he planted it in the soil of his family's growing enterprise. The beauty of double-entry bookkeeping, though it may sound strange to say that numbers can possess beauty, lay in its demand for honesty. When you recorded a transaction in two places, one on each side of the ledger, those two sides had to balance. They had to match perfectly, or the error would announce itself to you like a bell ringing in an empty room. You could not deceive yourself. You could not persuade yourself that you were wealthier than you truly were, or that a failed venture had been more profitable than the accounts revealed. The system forced clarity upon those disciplined enough to use it properly. Most merchants of Augsburg and the surrounding German territories had no such discipline. They kept their accounts in a looser fashion, recording what they could remember, what seemed important, what might be useful to recall. Their methods were fragmentary, scattered across different parchments and different minds. If a merchant died, his son might not fully understand what his father had owned or owed, and disputes would arise. Fortunes would be lost or claimed falsely because no one could prove with absolute certainty what the actual state of the house had been. The Fuggers, by contrast, kept records of extraordinary precision. Every transaction was entered twice. Every payment, every receipt, every loan extended and every debt incurred lived in two places simultaneously, creating a perfect mirror image. When Jakob or one of his sons wished to understand the true state of their wealth at any given moment, they need only look at the final balance. Assets on one side, liabilities on the other. The difference was what they possessed, what was genuinely theirs to spend or invest or lend. This clarity created an almost supernatural advantage. When a merchant elsewhere in Europe wished to borrow money, he might offer vague assurances of his worth. He might speak of lands he owned, or goods he expected to receive, or the reputation of his family. But the Fuggers could prove their wealth. They could open their ledgers and show, in meticulous detail, exactly what they owned and exactly how much they could afford to lend. This was not mere confidence, though it inspired confidence. This was proof, written in the language of numbers that did not lie. Moreover, the system revealed something else, something that previous accounting methods had obscured. It revealed the movement of money itself through time. A merchant could now see not just what he possessed at a single moment, but how his wealth had grown or shrunk over many months and years. He could trace the path of a particular shipment of cloth, from purchase to sale to final payment. He could see which ventures had been profitable and which had drained away resources. He could ask himself, with real data in hand, what he should do differently tomorrow. The Fuggers began to use their accounting system not merely as a record of what had happened, but as a tool for understanding what should happen next. They could calculate, with reasonable accuracy, what return a particular investment might yield. They could assess risk. They could decide whether to lend to a prince or a merchant or a bishop, based not on relationships or hunches, but on actual mathematical expectation. This was the beginning of modern finance, though few people recognized it as such at the time. As their banking operations grew larger and more complex, the Fuggers gradually evolved their double-entry system into something even more sophisticated. They began to keep separate ledgers for different aspects of their business. One ledger for the cloth trade, another for mining operations, another for their banking activities. And yet all of these subsidiary ledgers could be reconciled back to a master ledger, a grand account that showed the true financial picture of the entire House of Fugger. A merchant house, in other words, was beginning to look less like a collection of haphazard ventures and more like a single unified organism with a true heartbeat and a true measure of its health. This transformation in how the Fuggers organized their knowledge gave them a kind of vision that their competitors lacked. When the Habsburgs came to them requesting loans of increasingly enormous sums to fund imperial ambitions, the Fuggers could calculate with some precision what they could afford to lend and what terms they should demand. They understood risk. They understood compound interest. They understood leverage. These were not intuitions or tricks learned from experience alone. These were logical consequences of their accounting system, which made visible what had always been hidden in the mists of poor record-keeping. There was something almost alchemical about this, though it was merely mathematics and discipline. By keeping perfect records, by binding every transaction in a double knot of entry and counter-entry, the Fuggers had essentially created a mirror in which all of Europe's financial future could be faintly glimpsed. And because they could see it, they could shape it. The princes and emperors who came to them for money were, in a sense, subjects of their mathematics. They did not know it, and they would have resisted the thought if anyone had suggested it, but it was true. The rest of Europe would eventually learn what the Fuggers already knew. Over the 16th and 17th centuries, double-entry bookkeeping would spread gradually outward from Venice and from the Fugger counting houses in Augsburg, moving into the merchant communities of Antwerp and Amsterdam, eventually becoming the standard by which all serious merchants kept their accounts. It would become, in time, so universal that people would forget how revolutionary it had once seemed. But in those crucial decades when the Fuggers were consolidating their power, it remained a competitive secret, a way of seeing that belonged to only the most sophisticated and disciplined minds. And it was this way of seeing that allowed them to become what no merchant family had truly been before them, the architects of imperial finance, the quiet engineers of the world's greatest power. By the time Jakob Fugger reached the autumn of his life, having bent emperors and kings to his will through nothing more than the careful arrangement of numbers on paper, something curious began to turn in his thoughts. The wealth had multiplied beyond counting. The silver from Tyrol flowed like a river. The copper contracts stretched across kingdoms. The trading houses sent messages by courier that arrived in distant ports with predictable regularity. And yet, walking through the streets of Augsburg in his advancing years, Jakob would have seen something that no amount of ledger balancing could quite resolve. The press of the poor, the narrow alleys where families crowded into single rooms, the hunger that persisted even as the city's wealth visibly grew. It is worth pausing here to consider that Jakob Fugger, for all his ruthless financial acumen, seems to have been moved by something deeper than calculation. Perhaps it was age, perhaps it was the weight of his Catholic faith, which held that the rich bore an obligation to the poor, a teaching that echoed through the confessionals and market squares of the Renaissance. Or perhaps it was simply that a man who had built an empire of systems and order could not ignore the disorder of human suffering happening in his own doorstep. In 1514, Jakob Fugger purchased a tract of land on the eastern edge of Augsburg, outside the city walls, in a place that was neither fully urban nor quite rural. The land was modest. The vision, though, was extraordinary. What Jakob conceived of was something that had no clear precedent in the medieval world. It was not a monastery, though it carried hints of charity's ecclesiastical tradition. It was not an almshouse in the conventional sense, those dreary refuges where the poor were warehoused and left to fade quietly. It was something altogether different, a residential neighborhood, or perhaps the first true example of what modern planners would call social housing. Jakob decided to build a small village within the city, a place where the working poor could live with dignity rather than desperation. The concept seems almost impossible when one considers the world of the early 16th century, where poverty was viewed as either a misfortune to be managed or a moral failing to be endured, rarely as something that society bore a responsibility to ameliorate through systematic design. The Fugger, as it came to be known, was plotted with the precision you might expect from a man who had spent his entire life optimizing logistics and resource allocation. It would consist of a series of small, identical homes, modest but not squalid, built to specifications that ensured each family would have its own space, its own sense of place. The houses were arranged in neat rows, facing onto courtyards and quiet streets. There were gardens where residents could grow their own vegetables. There was a central square with a well at its heart, so that the essential resource of water need not become a daily struggle. Everything was ordered, economical, yet touched with a surprising warmth of consideration. The construction began in the years after Jakob had secured his vast fortune through the mining contracts and the imperial loans, and as the buildings rose, stone by stone, they represented something almost radical for the time. The notion that poverty was not inevitable, that human beings of modest means deserved more than mere survival. The families who were selected to live in the Fugger were not chosen randomly. There were criteria, standards that Jakob insisted upon. They were to be poor, yes, but not vagrant or criminal. They needed to be industrious, honest, willing to work. They should be Augsburg citizens who had fallen into difficulty through circumstance rather than vice. It was paternalistic, certainly. There is no escaping that. Jakob had opinions about who deserved assistance and who did not. And yet, for the families who met his standards, the Fugger offered something transformative. A family could rent a small cottage for a payment so modest that it freed resources for food and other necessities. They lived not in a charity ward, but in a community of similar circumstances. There was work to be found in Augsburg's growing industries. There was the possibility, faint but real, of lifting oneself upward. The rents charged in the Fugger were kept deliberately low, a sum so small that historians have sometimes struggled to determine whether Jakob was actually collecting them at all, or whether the entire project functioned more as an endowment, the rents being a nominal gesture rather than an actual income stream. The residents paid in what we might translate today as roughly 1 Rhenish guilder per year, a sum that represented perhaps a week's wages for a labourer. In some interpretations, the rent was purely symbolic, meant to preserve the dignity of the residents by allowing them to contribute something rather than simply receive charity. In others, it appears to have been genuinely collected, though the sums must have barely covered basic maintenance. Either way, the point seems to have been the same: to house the poor without requiring that they surrender their self-respect in exchange. What is particularly striking is that the Fugger was designed not merely as a temporary refuge, but as a permanent institution. Jakob endowed it with funds meant to sustain it beyond his lifetime. He provided in his will for its continued operation, for repairs, for the maintenance of the grounds. He had built, in essence, a permanent charitable structure that would outlive him by centuries. It was as though he understood, with the same clarity of vision that had allowed him to perceive the future profitability of Tyrolean copper, that his great fortune might not endure, but that these simple stone houses could. The Fuggeri, then, represented a kind of immortality different from the imperial loans or the mining contracts. It was mortality acknowledged and, through careful architecture and endowment, gracefully transcended. By the time Jakob Fugger died in 1526, the Fuggeri was not yet complete, but its form was unmistakable. His heirs would continue the project, and within a few years it had grown to include perhaps 106 houses, with a small chapel at its center. Over the centuries, it would expand and evolve, but the essential character would remain unchanged. It stood as a quiet challenge to the assumptions of medieval and Renaissance society. The idea that a wealthy man might choose to build not monuments to his own glory, but shelter for those he would never meet. One can imagine Jakob walking through the Fuggeri in his final years, watching families settle into the cottages, seeing the gardens take root, the community take shape. What would have gone through his mind? Satisfaction, perhaps. A sense that for all the manipulation and calculation that had defined his financial career, he had managed something genuine, something that would outlast both his fortune and his legend. The greatest fortune in Christendom, by the early 16th century, had become entangled with something that would seem almost abstract to a merchant's ledger, the salvation of human souls. And yet for the Fuggers, it was as concrete and tradable as silver ingots or bolts of cloth. Their connection to the Catholic Church would prove to be not merely profitable, but foundational to understanding how their wealth functioned in the world, and perhaps, in some small way, to the very upheaval that would soon shake Christian Europe to its foundations. To understand how the Fuggers became bankers to the Church itself, you must first imagine the peculiar bind in which the papacy found itself. Rome's coffers were perpetually empty. The construction of St. Peter's Basilica, that colossal monument to faith and human ambition, had swallowed fortunes. The Church needed money not for mere luxury, though luxury there certainly was, but for the operations of Christendom itself, the care of pilgrims, the feeding of the poor, the maintenance of parishes across every corner of Christian Europe. The problem was simple and eternal. The Church held vast lands and collected tithes, but it also had vast immediate needs. It required capital to function, and capital requires either conquest or credit. Enter the bankers. Jakob Fugger the Rich had by this point established such a reputation for financial stability, for the meticulous honoring of agreements, and for the sheer volume of resources at his command, that he had become the preferred creditor not of princes alone, but of the pontiff himself. The relationship was not born from piety, though Jakob was a faithful Catholic. It was born from a fundamental truth. The Fuggers could deliver money when others could not, and the Church could offer in return something uniquely valuable: legitimacy, access, and a steady stream of revenue that few other enterprises could match. The mechanism through which this occurred was, at its heart, a system as old as guilt itself. The Catholic Church offered indulgences, remissions of punishment for sins, granted by papal authority. In theory, these were acts of grace, freely given. In practice, and increasingly throughout the late medieval period, they had become items for sale. A wealthy merchant seeking absolution for his life of profit-taking could purchase a letter granting him remission from purgatorial suffering. A prince could buy indulgences for his deceased ancestors. The humble could save for months or years and purchase a smaller indulgence, perhaps forgiving a few years of penance. The revenue from these sales was meant, in theory, to flow toward the great building projects of the Church. In particular, much of this money was directed toward the completion of St. Peter's in Rome, that unfinished marvel that had consumed resources for generations. But the flow of this capital required infrastructure, channels, mechanisms of transfer, and authentication and accounting. It required, in short, bankers. The Fuggers, with their network of trading houses stretching from Rome to Vienna to Innsbruck, became the conduits through which this spiritual commerce flowed. Indulgences sold in Bavaria or Austria could be authenticated through Fugger offices. Monies collected in the Holy Roman Empire could be transferred to Rome through Fugger accounts. The Church granted the Fuggers the right to collect taxes and tithes in certain regions, and in exchange, the Fuggers managed both the collection and the transmission of these funds. This was not a simple transaction of buying low and selling high, the way a merchant might arbitrage cloth or spices. This was something more intricate and, perhaps, something more troubling. If you pause here for a moment, not to judge necessarily, but to consider, what begins to emerge is a question that would have been difficult for Jakob Fugger himself to avoid entirely. The sale of indulgences was not novel in the early 1500s. The practice had been growing for over a century, but the scale was increasing, and the Fuggers were helping to increase it. A person of conscience in that era might have wondered, what was the difference between indulgences and simple commercial transactions? If one could purchase one's way toward divine favor, did that not suggest that favor itself had become a commodity? And if it had become a commodity, was it really favor at all? Jakob Fugger, for all his sharp intelligence, was a man of his time. The distinction between spiritual authority and commercial interest would not have seemed to him as stark as it might seem to us. The Church needed money. The poor would benefit from those funds, presumably. The Fuggers were performing a service, and being compensated for it. Was that not simply the natural order of Christian commerce? And yet there was, somewhere beneath the surface of these transactions, a tension that was beginning to build. Consider the perspective of an ordinary person in the villages and towns of the German-speaking lands in the 1520s. You have a son who has died without receiving the last sacraments. You believe, as your entire culture has taught you to believe, that he is suffering in purgatory, a place of cleansing before the soul can reach heaven. A priest tells you that an indulgence can ease his suffering, that for a sum of money, perhaps equivalent to the wages you would earn in months, you can purchase a letter that grants remission of those punishments. That letter, authenticated with a seal, telling you that the Pope himself recognizes the absolution of your son's suffering. That letter, almost certainly, passed through the hands of Fugger intermediaries. That money, almost certainly, was counted and accounted for in Fugger ledgers before it reached Rome. Now ask yourself, what would such a person have felt if they learned that the indulgence they had purchased was, in some sense, a form of accounting fiction? Not that it was false. The Church did have the authority to grant indulgences, insofar as any temporal authority could claim such spiritual power, but rather that the process had become so thoroughly commercialized, so dependent upon the mechanisms of trade and profit that were the Fuggers' life work, that it was difficult to distinguish the spiritual act from the commercial one? Jakob Fugger himself died in 1525, in his mid-60s, having never seen the full consequences of the system he had helped build, but he lived long enough to see the first tremors. In 1517, a monk and theologian named Martin Luther had posted 95 theses to a church door in Wittenberg, directly challenging the Church's authority to sell indulgences. Luther's protest was scholarly, even tentative in its tone, but it struck a nerve that was already raw, and it did so precisely because the system Luther was criticizing had become so visible, so crude, so unmistakably about money. The irony, quiet and almost invisible to contemporaries, was that the very infrastructure that had been built to make indulgences easier to distribute, the Fugger banking networks, the standardized letters, the systematic collection, had also made the system's inherent contradictions more obvious. You cannot, after all, build an empire on the transfer of abstract spiritual goods without eventually having your commercial methods make clear that you are treating them as goods at all. The Fuggers were not the cause of the Reformation. That would be a crude simplification of history's complexity. But they were, perhaps, among its unwitting architects. They had woven themselves so deeply into the machinery of late medieval Christianity that when that machinery began to shudder and crack, the Fugger fortune would be caught up in the reverberations. For now, though, in these final decades of Jakob the Rich's life, they stood at the apex of their influence, their hands on the levers of both imperial power and ecclesiastical finance, their ledgers recording the movements of not merely money, but the spiritual anxieties of Christendom itself. And somewhere in the very middle of this golden age, as Jakob Fugger's ledgers grew thicker and his warehouses fuller, a small friar named Martin Luther was preparing to shake the foundations of everything the Fuggers had built their fortune upon. It's one of those quiet ironies that history sometimes offers us, a moment where the architect of wealth and the architect of spiritual revolution occupied the same European stage without ever meeting face to face, yet their fates were bound together in ways neither could have fully imagined. The Catholic Church, by the early 1600s, had become something quite extraordinary in its appetite for gold. The Pope in Rome, immersed in the grandeur of Renaissance art and architecture, required funds of almost incomprehensible scale. The building of St. Peter's Basilica alone consumed silver like a furnace consumes wood. And here is where the Fuggers found themselves in a peculiar position. They were among the very few men in Christendom with enough capital to lend the church what it needed, not just once, but repeatedly, across decades, as if the church were a sovereign nation perpetually at war with its own emptiness. To finance these repairs, these expansions, these architectural ambitions, the church developed a system, or perhaps refined an existing system, into something far more aggressive: the sale of indulgences. You might already know something of this, but the full mechanism is worth sitting with for a moment. An indulgence was a promise, a piece of parchment that claimed to reduce your time in purgatory after death. The poor bought them hoping for spiritual relief. The wealthy bought them in vast quantities. And the revenue flowed northward toward Rome through banking houses and merchant networks, and a significant portion of that wealth moved through Fugger hands. The Fuggers themselves were devout Catholics. This was not cynicism on their part, not a cold calculation masked as piety. They genuinely believed in the church's mission, genuinely saw themselves as serving Christendom, and yet their loans to the church, their financial arrangements with bishops and cardinals, meant that they had a vested interest in the church's system continuing to function exactly as it was. The sale of indulgences, even if morally questionable, was economically useful to them. It generated the revenues that allowed Rome to repay its debts. It kept the machinery turning. Now enter Martin Luther, a man who looked at this same system and saw something different entirely. He saw corruption. He saw the sacred being traded like common goods in a marketplace. He saw the poor being exploited, their meager savings extracted from them with promises of spiritual benefit. And on that November day in 1517, when he, according to tradition, nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, he was not thinking about the Fuggers. He was not thinking about banking networks or financial arrangements. He was thinking about the integrity of faith itself. And yet the Fuggers' money, indirectly, had enabled the very institution that Luther was attacking. This is not to say they were responsible for the Reformation. Such complex historical movements have countless causes, countless voices and pressures, but it is to notice that they were entangled with it. They had provided the liquidity that allowed Rome's extravagances to continue unchecked. They had profited from the sale of indulgences, the very practice that would become one of the focal points of Luther's critique. What's remarkable is how slowly this unraveled. Luther's protest did not immediately shatter the system. The Reformation did not happen overnight. For years, there were attempts at reconciliation, at reform from within. The Church initially did not view Luther as an existential threat, and during those years, the Fuggers continued their business with relative calm, though there must have been some awareness of the tremor beneath their feet. The question that hangs over this moment, and perhaps it's worth considering as you drift deeper into this narrative, is whether the Fuggers ever truly reckoned with their complicity in the system that Luther was dismantling. Did Jakob Fugger, in his later years, ever pause and wonder whether his loans to Rome had made him an instrument of the very corruption that was now calling down the wrath of 1,000 preachers across the German lands? There's no evidence that he did. By all accounts, he remained a conventional Catholic, a man shaped by the assumptions of his time. But here is the quiet truth. The Reformation, in the long run, would not be kind to the Fuggers. As Luther's movement spread, as kingdoms broke from Rome, as the sale of indulgences collapsed, the financial streams that had made the family so wealthy began to dry up. The Church, even the Catholic Church that remained after the Reformation, could no longer sustain the same level of extravagant spending. The Austrian and Spanish kingdoms that had once borrowed heavily from Fugger coffers would face their own fiscal crises. The assumption of endless growth, the belief that the system would continue indefinitely, would prove to be precisely the sort of illusion that all great fortunes eventually confront. In the years immediately following Luther's protest, though, none of this was visible. The Fuggers stood at their peak, their networks spreading ever wider, their influence touching the highest powers in the land. They could not have known, or perhaps they could not have fully accepted what they might have sensed, that the world they had so carefully financed and shaped was beginning, in very subtle ways, to shift. By the early 16th century, the Fugger enterprise had become something almost unimaginable in its reach, a web of commercial tendrils stretching across nearly every known trading port of the Renaissance world, pulling wealth back toward that single counting house in Augsburg like some great, patient spider drawing in its threads. To walk through the Fugger archives in those years would have been to encounter something profoundly modern, yet wrapped entirely in the language and customs of the late medieval world. Ledgers arrived from Lisbon, where Portuguese ships were loading spices and precious woods from the Indies. Reports came from Antwerp, that jewel of northern commerce, where cloth and metal goods moved through the harbour in endless streams. Venice sent news of eastern trades, silks from the Levantine routes, sugar, pepper, musk, and the rarer luxuries that only the richest houses in Europe could afford. And deeper still, the reports began to arrive from somewhere new, something that fascinated the Fuggers with the particular hunger of men who understood that the future of wealth belonged to those who could see it first. The Portuguese voyages had opened a passage to the Indian Ocean. Around the Cape of Good Hope, Portuguese caravels were returning laden with spices that commanded prices so extraordinary that a single hold of cloves or nutmeg could repay the cost of the voyage 10 times over. The Fuggers, patient and calculating as they were, did not rush into these waters themselves. Sailing to Asia was not a merchant's business but a king's, and the Portuguese crown guarded those routes jealously. But they understood something that few men grasped. Whoever financed the ships, whoever provided the credit that allowed these ventures to happen, would harvest a portion of every fortune made upon those voyages. And so the Fuggers began, quietly and without fanfare, to extend credit to Portuguese traders, to invest in shares of voyages, to position themselves not as explorers, but as the patient creditors who made exploration possible. In some sense, they had discovered something more valuable than any spice. They had discovered leverage. When news came across the Atlantic, when the Spanish began sending back their first treasures from the lands that Columbus had reached, the pattern repeated itself. The Fuggers could not go to the New World themselves, but they could finance those who would. They could supply the capital that Spanish merchants needed to outfit expeditions, to purchase slaves from Africa, to build the first trading posts that would become, across centuries, the foundation of an empire. From these distant ventures, the Fuggers took their cut, not always the lion's share, but enough. Enough to flow back into Augsburg, enough to be recorded in those careful ledgers, enough to compound with every other stream of wealth that poured into the family coffers. Consider the scale of this for a moment. The Fuggers, by the 1520s and 1530s, were not simply wealthy merchants in the old sense. They were something new entirely. They were what we might now recognize as a multinational corporation, though that word would have meant nothing to them. They had trading offices, factors they called them, scattered across the known world. In Lisbon, Antwerp, Venice, Cologne, Rome, Florence, Zurich, and Vienna, the Fugger name on a letter of credit meant something. It meant trust. It meant that the bearer could exchange that letter for actual coin or goods at any Fugger house. In an age when currency itself was uncertain and unstable, when different cities minted different coins with different metals and different values, when the reliability of money itself could never be taken for granted, the Fugger letter of credit had become, in effect, a kind of currency itself, more stable in some ways than any coin. What made this possible was the simple fact that the Fuggers were everywhere, and everywhere they were, they kept records. Double-entry bookkeeping, that innovation that seemed almost mundane by now, but was still relatively new to most of the world, allowed them to know, at any given moment, what they owned and what they owed in every port city where they kept a counting house. A merchant in Lisbon could draw on credit against a Portuguese venture and know that the Fugger house in Antwerp would honor it. The system was beautiful in its simplicity and terrifying in its power. It meant the Fuggers could move money across the world, not physically, not in ships carrying gold, but through the mere movement of words on parchment, through the fluid transfer of obligation and credit. Their main office remained in Augsburg, that busy city that had given them birth, but it had become something more than a mere headquarters now. It had become a kind of financial headquarters of Europe itself. Here, in the counting rooms, merchants came to arrange loans for their ventures. Here, the family made the decisions about which kingdoms to trust, which princes deserved credit, which ventures promised sufficient return to justify the risk. Jakob Fugger the Rich made these decisions with a combination of shrewd calculation and something that might almost be called intuition, though of course he would have called it the application of reason to the available facts. He studied his competitors, his debtors, the political landscape of Europe, with the intensity of a man who understood that a single miscalculation could unwind everything his family had built. The wealth at this point had become almost abstract. Historians have attempted to calculate it, to convert it into modern terms, but the exercise is fraught with difficulty. How do you measure the value of a man who is owed money by half the princes in Europe? How do you quantify credit itself when credit is based largely on the confidence others have in your ability to deliver? Jakob Fugger owned silver mines, entire mountains of metal that would keep generating wealth for generations. He owned shares in trading ventures, in import-export schemes, in the very commercial infrastructure that was binding Europe together. He owned properties, urban real estate, farmland. He owned ledgers full of promises to pay, thousands upon thousands of them, some made by great kings and some by humble merchants, all worth something, though what that something amounted to was a question no accountant could quite settle with certainty. And yet, as the peak was reached and stabilized, as the Fugger name became synonymous with the highest reaches of European wealth, there was something almost wistful about it. Jakob Fugger the Rich was an old man now, in his 70s, still working in the counting house, still making decisions, still studying the reports that came in from distant lands. He had achieved something that almost no one in the history of human commerce had achieved before. He had built an empire of wealth that touched nearly every corner of the known world, and he had done it not through conquest or inheritance, but through patience, skill, and an almost monastic dedication to the keeping of good records. He had lived to see his grandson, also named Jakob, begin to understand the business. He had watched his family rise from weavers to merchants to bankers to something far greater, to the men who made the wheels of European commerce turn. What would he have thought, one wonders, if he could have seen not only the height of Fugger power, but also its slow decline, the way that even empires built on such solid foundations of wealth and credit could gradually, inexorably, come undone. But that knowledge was still in the future, hidden away in years not yet lived, in the decisions not yet made, in the debts that had not yet become impossible to collect. For now, at this moment, and moments like this never last very long, though they feel as though they might, the Fugger fortune stood at its absolute zenith. The world was open to them. The future seemed infinite. When Jakob Fugger the Rich closed his eyes for the last time in 1525, he left behind not merely a fortune, but a living organism, a vast, breathing network of debts, obligations, mining contracts, royal pledges, and merchant relationships that stretched across nearly every corner of the known world. The question that faced his heir, his nephew Anton Fugger, was not how to grow this empire, but how to keep it breathing at all. For wealth at such a scale is not like money in a purse. It is more like a great ship at sea, requiring constant navigation, perpetual maintenance, and the unwavering attention of those at the helm. Anton Fugger was 44 years old when he inherited the responsibility of the family's affairs. He was Jakob's nephew, trained in the business since childhood, educated in the careful arts of ledgers and correspondence, yet stepping into shoes that felt, in those first quiet moments, impossibly large. The records show that he took his position with a certain grave humility, writing to his brothers and cousins in the tone of a man who understood the weight upon his shoulders. He would not be the builder that Jakob had been. His role, as he seemed to recognize it, was stewardship, preservation, the art of holding together what had been so carefully assembled. The empire Anton inherited was extraordinary in its complexity. The Fuggers held direct involvement in mining operations across Tyrol and Hungary, operations that required constant capital investment in tools, labor, and the perpetual management of geological unpredictability. They maintained trading houses in Rome, Venice, Lisbon, Seville, Antwerp, and Krakow. They had established themselves as the primary bankers to the Habsburgs, and this position, while immensely profitable, came with an obligation that few in the modern era can easily understand. They were, in effect, underwriting the ambitions of an emperor who was himself overextended in nearly every direction imaginable. The Habsburg debt was not a simple sum that could be calculated on a single page. It was a living, shifting thing, compounded by wars in Lombardy, the necessity of maintaining armies along the Turkish frontier, diplomatic missions that cost fortunes, the construction of palaces and fortifications, and the endless, grinding expense of keeping together a realm that stretched from Spain to Austria to the Low Countries to fragmented territories throughout the German lands. When an emperor needed funds, he did not simply borrow a sum and repay it on schedule. Rather, the Fuggers would advance money, sometimes in the form of loans but often as the direct financing of mercenary armies or fortifications, and repayment would come in the form of mining rights, monopolies, tax concessions, and other forms of economic privilege that might take years to realize their value. Anton's first decades in control were marked by a cautious expansion coupled with an almost anxious attention to the family's liquidity. The letters that survive from this period suggest a man constantly calculating, constantly aware that the structure he was maintaining operated on the principle of perpetual motion. If the Habsburgs did not pay what they owed, the mining operations could not be properly funded. If the mining operations failed, the cash flow that underpinned the banking operations would dry up. And if the banking operations faltered, the entire network of trust and credit upon which the family's reputation depended would begin to crack, like ice under the weight of an approaching thaw. Yet, despite these anxieties, Anton Fugger oversaw a period of remarkable stability. The copper and silver from Tyrol and Hungary continued to flow. The trading houses remained profitable. The Fuggers financed the Portuguese expeditions into India and beyond, taking shares in the spice trade that was reshaping the economics of Europe. They provided the capital for Habsburg armies fighting in Italy and along the Danube. And crucially, they maintained a network of relationships with other merchant families, with the great banking houses of Venice and Florence, with the treasuries of other European monarchs, relationships that allowed them to spread risk and maintain their creditworthiness even as individual ventures succeeded or failed. What many historians have noted, though often in quiet terms, is that Anton Fugger inherited his uncle's ruthlessness but not, perhaps, his hunger for expansion. Where Jakob had sought to build and to expand, to open new markets and enter new ventures with almost adolescent enthusiasm, Anton seemed content to consolidate and protect. Some might see this as caution, others might see it as wisdom. The truth, as with so many things of this period, probably lies somewhere between. The years of Anton's stewardship, roughly from 1525 until his own death in 1560, were also the years in which the scale of Habsburg ambitions began gradually to exceed the scale of Habsburg revenues. This was not yet catastrophic. The crisis would come later, in the reign of Philip II, but it was beginning to be perceptible to those who read the ledgers carefully. The emperor's debts were growing faster than his ability to repay them, and the Fuggers, as his primary creditors, found themselves in an increasingly complex position. They were owed enormous sums, but those sums were owed by a man whose political stability was essential to the stability of Europe as the Fuggers understood it. What happens when your greatest debtor is also your greatest necessity? The answer that Anton Fugger arrived at, through long experience and careful negotiation, was to extend credit further while simultaneously pressing for repayment of what could be repaid, and to diversify the family's holdings so that no single relationship, no matter how important, could topple the entire structure. He strengthened the Fuggers' involvement in the spice trade, which meant that if Habsburg fortunes declined, the family could fall back on the profits from pepper, nutmeg and cloves arriving in European ports. He maintained a careful eye on mining yields, always ensuring that the physical assets, the silver and copper extracted from the earth, provided a tangible foundation for the family's wealth, a grounding that mere paper promises from emperors and kings could never quite provide. There is something almost melancholy in reading the records of Anton Fugger's later years, when he was an old man supervising an empire that had begun, ever so subtly, to shift beneath his feet. He was not losing power. The Fuggers remained the most important bankers in Europe, but he could sense, perhaps, that the era of expansion was ending, that the world was beginning to move in directions that even the Fuggers could not entirely control. The Reformation had split Christendom. The Portuguese had opened new trade routes that bypassed the traditional merchants of Venice and the Mediterranean. The Spanish Empire in the Americas was beginning to funnel vast quantities of silver into European markets, and this influx of precious metal would eventually transform prices and economies in ways that no one in the 1550s could fully anticipate. And the Habsburgs, his family's greatest patron and greatest debtor, were beginning to feel the strain of overextension more acutely with each passing year. It was into this atmosphere of subtle, creeping uncertainty that Anton Fugger passed on his responsibilities. He did not leave his heirs a business that was failing. Rather, he left them a business that was impossibly complex, dependent on relationships that were beginning to fray, invested in a political structure that was slowly becoming unstable, and burdened with debts from the most powerful man in Europe, that might never be fully repaid. He had held the structure together through sheer intelligence and careful management, but the forces that would eventually bring it down were already in motion, gathering like storm clouds on the horizon, invisible yet inevitable, as patient and inexorable as the turning of seasons. Yet what happens when an empire builds itself so thoroughly on the promises of a single ruler, on the assumption that a throne will endure and a crown will pay? Even at the moment of Jakob Fugger's greatest triumph, as his name rippled across the ledgers of half of Europe, the foundations beneath the structure had begun to settle in ways that would take years to fully recognize. The mathematics of abundance that had worked so flawlessly through the prosperous decades of the 1500s began to face a question that no double-entry bookkeeping could solve. What becomes of a fortune when the prince who owes the fortune discovers he cannot pay? Charles V, that emperor whom Jakob had so carefully financed into power, ruled not merely one realm, but an archipelago of territories: Spain, the Low Countries, parts of Italy, and the vast holdings of the Habsburg inheritance in Central Europe. All of these required constant streams of gold to maintain their armies, their bureaucracies, their claims, and their wars. The religious schism that had torn Europe apart following Luther's 95 Theses transformed warfare from episodic skirmishes into something far more expensive and perpetual. The Holy Roman Emperor found himself fighting the Ottoman Empire in the east, suppressing religious rebellion across the German lands, and defending Habsburg interests in Italy against the French, who seemed to regard the peninsula as their rightful playground. Each of these conflicts demanded funding, and each demand fell ultimately upon the Fugger ledgers, like water dripping with the rhythm of a clock that never stopped. The Fuggers, at their height, had extended credit so vast and so intricate that it became difficult for anyone, perhaps even for the Fuggers themselves, to fully comprehend the true scale of exposure. They had financed not merely one campaign but dozens, one succession but multiple generations of imperial ambition. The assumption that had underwritten all of this lending was elegant in its simplicity. The emperor's ability to tax, to mine, to extract wealth from his dominions would naturally continue to grow. The future would always be able to pay for the present. But the future, as futures often do, began to arrive with different features than expected. By the middle of the 16th century, the silver mines of Tyrol and Hungary, those glittering foundations of Fugger fortune, had begun to show signs of depletion. The richest veins, the easiest silver to extract from the earth, had been worked for decades. Deeper shafts required more timber for supports, more workers, more investment in pumping equipment and ventilation. The cost of silver, in labor and materials, had crept upward in that inexorable way that prices do when demand remains constant, but supply requires ever greater effort to maintain. Meanwhile, something altogether unexpected was reshaping the entire European economy. Silver was beginning to arrive in unprecedented quantities from across the Atlantic, from the mountains of Peru and Mexico, from the New World mining operations that Spanish conquistadors had seized. The Fuggers had invested in these enterprises, had financed voyages and colonial ventures, but the glut of American silver flooding European markets began to devalue the very commodity upon which they had built their power. The relationship between the Fuggers and the Habsburgs had always been symbiotic, but symbiosis only endures when both partners benefit. As imperial debts accumulated faster than imperial revenues could service them, the emperor's ability to pay interest, let alone principal, began to falter. Charles V, that energetic ruler who had once moved through Europe like a chess master, advancing pieces across a vast board, found his options contracting. He could not simply refuse to pay the Fuggers, for they remained too important, too essential to the machinery of imperial credit. But neither could he easily pay what he owed, for his revenues simply would not stretch that far. The solution, The quiet solution that monarchs have employed across the centuries was to pay partially, to negotiate extensions, to pledge future revenues that would arrive in years rather than months. It was, in essence, the beginning of a slow default disguised as prudent financial management. Jakob Fugger the Rich had died in 1525, and his nephew and successor, Anton Fugger, inherited not only the house's wealth, but also its exposure to what was increasingly becoming understood as a problematic situation. Anton was capable, intelligent, well-trained in the methods of banking and trade, but he faced a dilemma that no amount of acumen could fully resolve. The debts of the Habsburg Empire were so deeply woven into Fugger holdings that extracting themselves would have meant writing off losses that would cripple the company. It would have meant, in essence, admitting publicly that the greatest banking house in Europe had overextended itself. Instead, Anton Fugger made the agonizing calculation that many institutions have made before and since, that staying committed to a failing debtor was less damaging than cutting ties and admitting failure. The Fuggers would continue to lend. They would continue to extend credit. They would hope that the situation would reverse, that the emperor would find new sources of wealth, that the crisis would pass as crises sometimes do. But this was not a temporary crisis. It was the beginning of a transformation in the European political economy, one that would ultimately render the Fugger model of wealth, built on financing monarchy, on betting that princes would pay, increasingly fragile. The Spanish Habsburgs declared bankruptcy in 1557, only 3 decades after Jakob had financed Charles into the imperial throne. The word bankruptcy had not long existed in its modern form, had not yet acquired all the grim machinery of legal procedure that would later surround it, but the reality was unmistakable. The emperor could not pay his debts. The Fuggers, along with other creditors, faced the nightmare scenario that lenders dread above all others: the moment when the promise of repayment is abandoned, when the ledger entry shifts from owed to us to never to be recovered. That first bankruptcy would not be the last. Over the following decades, the Spanish crown would repudiate its debts repeatedly, each time sending tremors through the Fugger accounts. The careful structures that had been built over generations, the assumption that imperial credit was the safest credit that could exist, proved to be built on foundations that could shift. The Fuggers' empire would survive these shocks, would continue to function, would remain the wealthiest family in Europe for decades longer. But something essential had changed. The certainty had cracked, and in the ledgers kept by Fugger accountants, in the conversations held quietly in their Augsburg counting houses, there was now an awareness that the future would not necessarily be an extension of the past, that abundance could reverse, that even the greatest fortunes built on credit can be vulnerable when the creditor is a throne that cannot pay. It is worth pausing here to consider what this moment must have felt like, not in the grand abstract terms of economic history, but in the small human reality of seeing years of accumulated wealth suddenly become uncertain. The Fuggers had made their fortune by being more careful, more systematic, more disciplined than their competitors, and yet all of that discipline could not protect them from the simple fact that they had wagered the majority of their capital on the solvency of a single debtor, an emperor who ruled half of Europe and controlled none of it completely. But fortunes, no matter how intelligently woven into the fabric of empires, are subject to forces that even the most careful merchant cannot control. And as Jakob Fugger the Rich slipped toward the end of his life in the 1520s, the machinery he had constructed with such precision began to encounter resistance. The vast loans to the Habsburgs continued to accumulate. Charles V, for all his imperial majesty, remained perpetually indebted, and unlike the controlled risks of the textile trade or the measured yields from mining operations, imperial debt is a creature of politics and war, unpredictable, sometimes uncollectible, always wearing away at the edges of even the greatest fortunes. In the years following Jakob's death, His nephew Anton Fugger inherited not just wealth, but the terrible weight of knowing how it was made. Anton was a competent banker, deeply educated, and genuinely pious in his own way, but he inherited an empire at a moment when the ground beneath it had begun to shift. The Reformation, that spiritual earthquake that had rippled outward from Martin Luther's protest, had fractured not only the church but the financial relationships that had sustained the Fuggers' rise. The indulgence trade, that lucrative intersection of piety and profit that had flowed so reliably through their vaults, was beginning to dry up. Fewer pilgrims purchased absolution. The church's moral authority had been cracked, however subtly, and with it came a kind of moral suspicion that clung to those who had profited from its apparatus. And then there were the Habsburgs themselves, perpetually in crisis, perpetually at war. The Ottoman threat pressed from the east. Religious conflict tore at the empire from within. The Habsburgs borrowed and borrowed and borrowed, until the cumulative weight of their debt became something the Fuggers could no longer simply absorb as the cost of maintaining influence. A merchant house, no matter how large, cannot indefinitely finance an empire that bleeds gold in every direction. There are limits, invisible but real, to what even incomparable wealth can sustain. The Fuggers began, slowly and reluctantly, to tighten the purse strings. They became more cautious with new ventures. The far-flung trading houses that had once represented the cutting edge of commercial ambition began to seem less like opportunities and more like liabilities. Competition was growing. The Portuguese had begun their direct trade routes to India and beyond, bypassing the traditional overland routes that had enriched the Fugger counting houses. The spice trade, that glittering prize that had lured merchants across continents, was being redirected. And though the Fuggers adapted, pivoting toward metals and emerging trade routes to the Americas, there was a quality of defense now in their movements, rather than conquest. The Habsburg bankruptcies began to pile up like snowfall in a harsh winter. In 1557, in 1575, in 1596, year after year, the Holy Roman Emperor would simply declare that he could no longer pay his debts. The Fuggers, along with other creditor families, would find themselves holding paper that was suddenly worth far less than the ink used to write it. Some of these losses were absorbed, some were negotiated away, carefully, in a dance of power and compensation. But each time, the Fugger fortune diminished, particle by particle. The accumulated wealth of generations began to disperse like dust. What had made the Fuggers so powerful, paradoxically, now became a source of their vulnerability. They were too entangled with the fate of the Habsburg dynasty. They had bet everything on empire, on imperial power, on the assumption that their influence could shape events from the shadows. But empires do not bend to the will of financiers alone, no matter how clever or generous those financiers might be. The 30 Years' War, that grinding catastrophe that would soon consume Central Europe, was still gathering its terrible momentum, but its shadow was already visible to those who knew how to read the signs. By the early 17th century, the Fuggers were no longer the undisputed masters of European finance. Other families, the Medicis, had by then declined themselves, but new powers were rising, had begun to compete for the great loans that now flowed primarily to Spanish and French monarchs, rather than the Habsburgs. The Dutch were becoming ascendant, their merchant republics and trading companies beginning to eclipse the old patterns of Italian and German finance. The world was shifting beneath their feet, and the Fuggers, for all their adaptability, found themselves moving more slowly than the currents that now surrounded them. It is worth pausing here to sit with a question that the documents and ledgers cannot fully answer. At what point does a family become aware that it is in decline? Is there a moment when the last great decision is made, a final transaction that marks the beginning of the end? Or does it happen so gradually that only history, looking backward with the clarity of centuries, can see the precise instant when ascent became descent. Perhaps it is both. Perhaps it happens slowly for those living through it, but appears sudden to those of us reading about it from a remove of 500 years. The Fuggerei itself, that monument to Jakob's charitable vision, continued to stand. Its residents remained clothed and housed, but around it, the activity of the counting houses began to diminish. The ledgers grew less voluminous. Fewer ships departed with Fugger goods stamped upon their manifests. The family remained wealthy, certainly. They never fell into poverty or obscurity entirely. But the kind of wealth that moves empires, that whispers in the ears of emperors, that reshapes the flows of trade across continents, that kind of wealth was slipping away. The younger generations of Fuggers seemed to sense it, perhaps, in the growing melancholy that marked some of their portraits. They continued to marry well, to position themselves carefully within the merchant aristocracy. They became patrons of the arts, collectors of curiosities, builders of grand houses. They performed the rituals of power, even as the actual substance of power was slowly ebbing. It is a pattern we shall see repeated many times across the centuries. The outward signs of wealth and influence persist, even after the underlying reality has shifted. The costume remains intact long after the character wearing it has begun to fade. By the middle of the 17th century, the Fuggers were no longer the family that could decide the fate of nations. The age of merchant princes financing empires from behind velvet curtains was beginning to give way to something new, something that would eventually crystallize into the modern financial systems we inhabit. The Fuggers had been the bridge between feudalism and modernity, between the old trade guilds and the new world of global commerce. But they had not survived the crossing intact. Some empires change, some simply end. The Fugger decline was neither sudden nor absolute, but it was real, and it was moving with the inevitability of seasons turning, of empires aging, of the very stones of their counting houses growing cold. When we think of the world's greatest fortunes, our minds tend to drift toward the names that belong to the industrial age. Rockefeller, with his oil monopolies, Carnegie, with his steel mills, the Vanderbilts and their railways stretching across a continent. These are the titans we celebrate in our textbooks, the figures whose wealth seems almost incomprehensibly vast to the modern ear. Yet if we pause and consider the mathematics of it all, if we account not for raw dollars, but for the proportion of total European wealth that one family controlled, the Fuggers emerge from history's shadow with a claim that may actually exceed what Rockefeller would ever command. Jakob Fugger the Rich, in the year of his death, controlled perhaps 4 to 6% of all the wealth circulating through Europe. John Rockefeller, at the peak of Standard Oil's dominion, controlled somewhere near 1.5 to 2% of American wealth alone. But America was only one nation among many, and the calculation becomes hazier when we begin to account for the vastly different scale of global GDP in the 20th century. What becomes clear, if we hold both fortunes up to the light, is that the Fuggers were operating in an economic world where their relative grip was perhaps tighter, their influence on the machinery of nations perhaps more visible and direct. The difference, though, lies not in the numbers, but in the nature of the power itself. Rockefeller controlled an industry, oil. It was a commodity that grew more valuable with each passing year as the world industrialized, as automobiles replaced horses, as refineries multiplied across continents. His wealth was the outcome of technological inevitability and consumer appetite. He could not have failed, one might argue, so long as he maintained his focus and avoided catastrophic mismanagement. The market itself would have carried him upward. The Fuggers, by contrast, were architects of something far more precarious. They did not control an industry, they controlled the flow of capital itself. They were the middlemen between powerful men who needed money and the reservoirs of wealth necessary to lend it. This placed them in a position of extraordinary leverage, but also of extraordinary vulnerability. Imagine holding the balance of European politics in your ledgers. knowing that should a single emperor default on his debts, should a war turn unexpectedly, should the mining operations in Hungary flood or collapse, your entire empire could fracture. Rockefeller's wealth was insulated by the scale of industrial production. The more oil was needed, the richer he became. But the Fugger's wealth was hostage to the decisions of kings and popes, to the success of military campaigns, to the stability of trade routes that could be severed by weather or piracy or the whims of foreign rulers. Rockefeller could diversify into other ventures because Standard Oil generated such formidable returns. The Fuggers could not so easily retreat. They were already stretched across silver, copper, spices, textiles, banking, real estate, and political patronage. Every extension of their reach was both an opportunity and a thread of tension in the tapestry they had woven. And perhaps this is the deeper reason why the Fuggers have faded from our collective memory while Rockefeller's name endures. Rockefeller's wealth had the quality of inevitability about it. It felt like the natural order of industrial capitalism. His fortune seemed almost geological in its solidity. The Fuggers, by contrast, represented a different kind of power, more fragile, more contingent, more dependent on the continued favor of those they financed. Their decline, when it came, did not feel like a failure of business acumen, but like the inevitable erosion of a structure built on sand. Yet there is something worth noting in how the Fuggers spent their wealth, something that distinguishes them from Rockefeller in a way that sleep-time reflection might appreciate. Rockefeller, to be fair, became a philanthropist of genuine significance. His foundation revolutionized education and medical research. But his giving came late, after the fortune was made, almost as though wealth and benevolence were separate chapters in the same book. The Fuggers, by contrast, were building institutions of social welfare even as they were accumulating their power. The Fuggerai was constructed not as an afterthought to prosperity, but as a parallel project, a statement of values held even while the machinery of finance ground forward. Is this a meaningful distinction, or merely the difference between how two eras understood obligation and legacy? Perhaps we cannot say with certainty. The records are incomplete, and the motives of the dead are always more difficult to read than they first appear. Yet the fact remains that when Jakob Fugger commissioned housing for the poor of Augsburg, when he ensured that ordinary workers could dwell in dignity in a purpose-built community, he was not following a model that Rockefeller would later perfect. He was inventing something new, something that spoke to a medieval and early modern sensibility about the duties of the wealthy toward those who labored in their service. Rockefeller's scale was larger, his reach wider, his impact on the modern world more direct. Standard Oil transformed global commerce and daily life in ways that the Fuggers could scarcely have imagined. And yet the Fuggers possessed a certain grace in their decline that Rockefeller's dynasty, for all its endurance, has not entirely replicated. Their wealth did not endure, but what they built in stone and principle, the houses that still shelter the poor, the innovations in finance that still structure markets, the stories that still reward contemplation across the centuries, these have proven more durable than all the oil ever pumped from the earth. The comparison between them, then, is not a matter of determining who was greater. It is rather a meditation on the different shapes that human accumulation can take, on how wealth expressed itself in different eras, and on the question of what endures when the fortunes themselves have fallen away. In Augsburg, on a winter evening, the Fuggerai still stands. Its rooms still shelter those in need. Rockefeller's Standard Oil was broken apart by antitrust action more than a century ago. The empire of oil continues, certainly, fragmented now into many companies, but the unified vision, the monopolistic control, that has vanished into the past as thoroughly as the Fugger ledgers that record transactions no one alive will ever need to understand again. And so we arrive at the twilight of empires, not with fanfare or sudden rupture, but with the quiet erosion that time permits all things built by human hands. The Fuggers, who once seemed as permanent as the stone walls of Augsburg itself, have dissolved into memory. Their vaults are empty. The counting houses that hummed with the careful scratch of quills recording the wealth of continents now stand as museum pieces, their ledgers sealed behind glass for the curious to admire. The ships that carried their silks and spices across unknown seas have long since rotted into the ocean floor. The silver that emerged from Hungarian mines, ton after ton, refined and cast into coins that bore the imprint of their ambition, all of it has scattered into the hands of others, transformed into new forms, new currencies, new dreams of men who forgot, or never knew, from whence it came. It is a strange thing to contemplate the trajectory of absolute power and imagine it rendered into nothing. Jakob Fugger the Rich, at the height of his influence, could have spoken a word and kingdoms would have trembled. He could have withheld credit and watched emperors falter. He could have written the price of salvation itself. Yet when death came, as it comes to all, none of that remained his. His body returned to dust in the Cathedral of Augsburg, and the empire he had built with such precision and cunning began its long descent into irrelevance. Not immediately. The Fuggers retained considerable wealth and influence for generations after him. But inevitably, as the world turned and new centers of power emerged, new merchants arose, new technologies rewrote the rules of commerce. What had seemed eternal became merely old. What had appeared unshakable was revealed, in time, to be constructed of the same fragile materials as everything else: ambition, circumstance, and the temporary alignment of conditions that no human effort can hold in place forever. But there is something else that remains, something that Jakob Fugger built with equal intention, but perhaps with deeper foresight. The Fuggerei still stands in Augsburg. Even now, in the present moment, as you drift somewhere between waking and sleep, those modest brick houses, arranged in neat rows, exist in the gentle evening darkness of a southern German city. They are neither grand nor ostentatious. They were never meant to be. They were built, and continue to be inhabited, as shelters for the poor, for the widows and the elderly and the displaced, those for whom the machinery of commerce had ground them down. Jakob Fugger, in an act that contemporary observers found almost incomprehensibly generous, had set aside his wealth not merely to accumulate more wealth, but to construct permanence of a different kind. The Fuggerei has survived fires and wars, and the complete collapse of the fortune that funded it. It has endured the rise and fall of empires, the invention of gunpowder, the printing press, the steam engine, the electrical grid, the internet, and it continues to shelter human beings whose names will never appear in history books, who will live quiet lives within those walls and then pass into the same great forgetting that claimed the Fuggers themselves. What does it mean to reflect on this with the eyes of someone who has followed this family from their first appearance in the markets of Augsburg to their gradual disappearance into the background of history? Perhaps it means recognizing that the greatest works are sometimes the least celebrated. The gold and the silver, the ledgers and the political maneuvering, the careful orchestration of imperial elections, and the delicate balance of debts spanning continents, all of that was extraordinary. All of it was the stuff of which history is made. And yet it is gone, dispersed, forgotten by all but those who study such things in quiet libraries. But the Fuggerei remains, simple brick houses with simple rooms, where simple people find shelter and rest their heads each night. In a curious inversion of what we might expect, the lasting monument is not the one built for glory, but the one built for compassion. There is a question that settles over this story as we approach its end, a question that perhaps has no final answer. Does the accumulation of wealth matter if it cannot be held? Does power retained through the manipulation of credit and the financing of empires have value if it dissolves within a few generations? Or is the only wealth that truly endures the kind that is shared, that is woven into the fabric of daily life, that is given away rather than hoarded? Jakob Fugger was not primarily a philanthropist. He was a businessman, driven by profit and by the desire to extend his family's reach and influence. The Fuggerei was, in one sense, a business decision, a way to secure his reputation, to ensure that the Fugger name would be remembered not merely as one of greed, but of grace. And yet the effect remains the same. Long after his competitors are dust and their names are forgotten, long after the riches they accumulated have been lost or stolen or simply worn away by time, the shelters he built continue to provide refuge. Picture it now, if you can, in the darkness of this evening in Augsburg. The streets are quiet. The modern city has grown up around the old quarter, skyscrapers and automobiles surrounding the medieval core where the Fuggers once walked. But in one particular neighborhood, in one particular cluster of houses, lights glow softly behind small windows. Some are reading, some are preparing for sleep, as you are. Some are sitting in silence, listening to the distant sounds of the city, feeling the safety of walls that have stood for 5 centuries. These are the inheritors of Jakob Fugger's paradoxical legacy, not the heirs who received the fortune, many of whom squandered it or saw it depleted by the inexorable logic of historical change, but the poor, the forgotten, the ordinary people for whom a roof and a room mean everything. The pattern that emerges, if one follows this family from beginning to end, is one of circulation. Wealth circles through history, like water through the earth. It rises in spring rains, collects in great reservoirs, flows into channels that carry it across continents, nourishes life in countless forms, and then evaporates back into the atmosphere, only to fall again as rain. No individual holds it permanently. The Fuggers were simply one of the most skilled at diverting that flow, at collecting it, at directing it toward their purposes. But the fundamental circulation continued regardless of them. They could speed it or slow it. They could determine who benefited and who did not, but they could not stop it. And when their turn came to let it go, as all turns eventually do, the flow continued onward into other hands, other schemes, other dreams of expansion and control. What endures, ultimately, is not the wealth, but the architecture of compassion. The Fuggerei remains because it was built not for display, but for use. It was built not to glorify the Fuggers, but to serve humanity. And in that service, it has outlasted every palace, every monument, every grandiose project conceived by the mind of power. The stones themselves have become sacred not because of whom they were built by, but because of whom they shelter. On a night like this, when the temperature drops and the wind carries the chill of autumn through the streets of Augsburg, those small rooms in the Fuggerei are warm and safe. People rest there, they dream there. They find peace within those walls, and that peace is the only permanence that really matters. The Fuggers are gone, their empire is gone. The wealth that once flowed through their hands has dispersed into the vast ocean of human commerce, absorbed into countless lives and projects, most of it forgotten. But the Fuggerei remains, the poor remain, the shelter remains, and perhaps that is the only epitaph any family needs, not the size of their fortune or the scope of their influence, but the continuation of shelter for those who have none. As your eyes grow heavier and your breathing slows, as the weight of sleep begins to pull you gently downward into rest, consider the Fuggers not as historical figures of extraordinary power, but as people who, at the very end of their story, built something that would outlast the memory of their own names. They built shelter, and in a world of impermanence, where all things rise and fall and dissolve back into the dust from which they came, that simple act of building shelter for others becomes, perhaps, the truest form of immortality.